You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Coming to you now live from the divided states of America. It is time for another show, another 3 hours of the most disruptive show in American politics. On the West Coast and in the politically independent corner, I am investigative radio show host and political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And on the East Coast, coming from the left, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together bringing you the news every morning, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get straight into it. First up, we have the headlines. As always, we do these 3 times every morning, 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern, 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. After that, after the first batch of headlines, we're going into Jamarl's monologue, where he talks about the news of the day or anything that's getting him deeply thinking. After that, we usually take calls. That'll be in about 15 minutes. You can call in now, though, if you want to, or just prep to call in a few. 202-521-1320. That's the number, 202-521-1320. But without further ado, let's get straight into headlines. First up, Vice Presidential candidate Joseph R. Biden, Joe Biden Jr., is traveling to Kenosha, Wisconsin today, where while there, he's expected to meet with the family of Jacob Blake. That's the 29-year-old man who was shot in the back, triggering protests and some rioting in the city. Biden's visit comes just 2 days after Trump's visit to the city. We'll see how this one goes. My next headline, President Trump is going after funding to mayors of states he says are being soft on crime. In a tweet yesterday, he said his administration, I'm going to quote here, will do everything in its power to prevent weak mayors and lawless cities from taking federal dollars while they let anarchists harm people, burn buildings, and ruin lives and businesses. We're putting them on notice today, end quote. He then tagged the director of the Office of Management and Budget, that's on Twitter again. This follows a weeks-long back and forth between President Trump and Mayor Ted Wheeler of Portland, including a tweet Trump posted earlier in the night in which the president mocked Wheeler for his handling of the protests. In my next story, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is advising states that a vaccine will likely be ready November 1st. That came in a letter to governors that it sent out. In that letter, they said that hospitals and health departments will be the first recipients of the vaccine. Makes sense, but that's the big qualification there. Another big headline here, Tom Seaver has died. The American baseball pitcher, also known as Tom Terrific and the Franchise, played for the New York Mets, Cincinnati Reds, the Chicago White Sox, and the Boston Red Sox in an almost 20-year career lasting from 1967 to 1986. That came before he was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame by the highest percentage of votes ever recorded. Seaver had suffered from memory problems for years, was diagnosed with dementia in 2019, formally withdrawing from public life. He passed away in his sleep from the combined consequences of that dementia and the novel coronavirus from COVID-19. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the deficit will reach $3.3 trillion. That's more than triple last year's deficit, and that's the largest gap between the deficit and the GDP since World War II. That puts the U.S. in a class of countries, including Japan, Greece, and Italy. We talk about modern monetary theory. I think this is the other side of that. If we're spending a lot of money, we can go back to this. I don't mean to make the lambast in economic theory. We can come back to it. Next headline: the University of South Carolina is reporting more than 1,200 coronavirus infections with more than 100 new cases each day. That makes it what some people are calling the fastest rate of coronavirus growth at a university in the U.S. Again, the University of South Carolina. At that university, they report that the infection rate was reportedly 28% as of last week. University has cracked down on off-campus parties, but it said that they have no plans to cancel in-person classes, which again just opened a couple of weeks ago. Over in San Francisco, Pelosi is claiming that she was set up by a San Francisco salon where she went in reportedly to get a blowout. Again, the salon was shuttered following regulations, following lockdowns on the coronavirus. And again, apparently she was filmed. You can see the footage. Trump was pushing back on her earlier this week. But what she's saying is that they set her up, that the salon set her up. I don't know how much of an excuse that actually, I don't know how far that'll actually go. Anyway, that's definitely an optical thing. Also, the United States has imposed sanctions on International Criminal Court officials over their bribe into war crimes in Afghanistan. Specifically, Mike Pompeo announced 2 sanctions, one going after ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, another going after the ICC's head of Jurisdiction, Complementary, and Cooperation Division, Makiso Machochoko. Our next headline, protests erupted in Rochester, New York after police released body cam footage on Wednesday showing Rochester officers handcuffing Daniel Prude, placing a hood over his head and pressing his face into the pavement until he is silent. Daniel's brother called the police for help because Daniel was reportedly having a mental incident. In the video, medics performed CPR on Prude before loading him into an ambulance. Prude died 7 days later on March 30th. That was earlier this year. The autopsy report from the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office, meanwhile, says his cause of death included, quote, complications of asphyxia in the setting of physical restraint, end quote. Over in Europe, France is announcing a multi-billion-dollar recovery plan, including a plan to hire 160,000 people to, among other things, build green tech transportation, build more housing, and to promote, quote-unquote, social cohesion, whatever that means. But hey, I guess I get what they mean. In our next headline, my last headline this morning, a typhoon is hitting South Korea today, taking down power to nearly 300,000 homes. Meanwhile, Japan's Coast Guard is searching for a livestock ship that was supposed to have capsized in the storm, widely believed to have capsized in the storm. Only one crew member of that ship has been rescued so far. The ship was carrying 43 people. And again, only one of those people has been rescued so far. It was also carrying at least 6,000 head of cattle. Poor people, poor cows too. Again, that ship was carrying 6,000 head of cattle from New Zealand to China. That's my last headline. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what's on your mind today? What are you talking about?
I want to start here. It's going to sound like a weird starting point, but I think it's apt. After going to the People's Convention the other day, after speaking at the People's Convention, and just in some of the conversations we've been having, and some of the conversations I've been seeing other people have, people who are considered lefties, where are we when our radicals break? When you think of that, right? Where are we when the most radical of the bunch, of the people who they consider the left, that the Democratic Party has found just the right pressure point for even the most radical people within the context that would be considered the left, scream uncle. Thick-neck Tony, the immortal, screaming, crying in the yard. The indignity of it all. You know, on Supernatural, Dean Winchester suffered in hell for 40 years before he broke, and he got off the table and started torturing other souls. His dad stayed there for 100 years and never broke. And they made the point that your dad was made of the stuff of heroes, and Dean carried that as somewhat of a burden on himself. Democracy itself, or representative government, demands a certain thing. It demands that your political leaders come and get your vote, and that you and a coalition of you say, this is what we want. And those political leaders say, great, and they go and they do a job. The idea, philosophically anyway, is that the job they do is in some way correlated to what you want them to do. Meaning, you are stuck with the responsibility of holding them accountable. Now, what does accountability mean? Yes, it means voting. Yes, it means protests. Yes, it means waving signs and bugging them and annoying them and everything else. And yes, it means there's policy that you want, that you expect, that they come to you and they say, we're going to enact X or Y. And you say, I like that. You got my vote, buddy. Or I don't like that. You don't have my vote. Imagine what happens for a moment when that process gets inverted. Where instead of, I have a political idea that I want. These are the things that I want. And your political leader instead says, I don't care. And you say, well, all right, screw you. I'm going to go to the other party. And these guys are talking helter-skelter. And you have to give the other guy a look again. And you don't like that look. You hate that look. But believe it or not, Democracy itself demands that you let him lose. It's not that you love it. It's the point that you cannot invert the process. And I don't care how terrifying the other person is, you get to a point where you must realize if you invert that process, you create a downward spiral where it no longer matters what you want politically. It only matters that they are your saviors. I'm telling you, this is where we are. Yes, there'll be some people that would love that Democrat, that Joe Biden of the world, but the majority of the people don't. And the fact that the majority of the people don't is getting across something that is clear and that is a problem. You have lost your representative government. Prove me wrong. How am I wrong? Now, when I say that, I'm saying that because they found the exact formula, the right pressure point, the hit to make them knuckle, where you say, okay. He's too terrifying. I am making the point that if that pressure point exists now, I guarantee you it would exist in 4 years. It would exist in another 4 years. It would exist in another 4 years. It is utterly bizarre that lefties of everybody, and to be honest, anyone in the political spectrum, accepts the inversion of the argument that it is the candidate's job to get your vote. Now, here's the catch. One or two things happens. If you and your countrymen said, this is what we want regarding policy, the Democrats say, we don't care. Republicans say, we don't care. And the Democrats, who, let's say, on that side of the political spectrum anyway, come up with a candidate that represents the rich, the 1%, and they come to you and say, look, Republicans are maniacs. You can accept the maniacs who are also bought, yes, or you can accept us. We're more dignified, we wear suits, and we will be incrementally least worse. Now, when people make that argument of least worse, understanding what they're saying, they are basically making an argument to you. It's a one concentration camp less argument. It's a poverty argument. They would say, hey, Jamal, how dare you not vote for Joe Biden? And I would say, I am not a Democrat. And I would make the point to them, especially if they're lefties, that it is very bizarre that you're accepting the inversion of an argument, that your responsibility, you are given a cosmic, philosophical responsibility to represent the interests of American public, especially the downtrodden, which has gotten to be a larger and larger share. You're forsaking your responsibility. You should be out there screaming that that party is not representing the interests of the public. You should be screaming that the polling and everything else shows that this is what the public wants. This is the center of the public. You are a radical party. And you should be making the argument to the tunes of tens of millions that this is what the public wants. If you do not represent what the public wants, you lose. I don't care if Satan himself is on the other side of the dispatch box. This question is entirely yours. This is our demand. This is no different than walking off of a company that is taking advantage of you and exploiting your labor. It is not without risk. Your party can make the argument that we don't care. We will tank it to Trump just to not set the precedent of giving in to a demand to the public. Now, my argument is you've lost your democracy. And that argument will be that much more clear if they do that. The catch for you is, what do you do if you have lost your democracy, where neither party is receptive to you? And understand, you are in part responsible for that. Because year after year after year, as you've inverted the process, they have become accustomed to you doing that. That's not an easy position to take, by the way. If you are a standard Democrat in the Democratic Party, that 0.1%, that's representing 300 million people, there's a difference in threat. If you tank it, Nancy Pelosi still has $100 million. In fact, after Trump, she would have more than $100 million. Many of the Democrats in Congress, they're fantastically wealthy. If you tank it, they are going to remain fantastically wealthy, getting more so. You, however, will not. This is no different than the people who are walking off of a company risking their jobs. but putting the company in peril also. That is no different. Lefties love it when people strike, hate it when they have to do it in the political spectrum, entailing risk for themselves. But the reality of it is, a party's job is to get your vote. And you, to the tune of millions of lefties, should be standing there screaming, this is what we want. Even if it's not everything on the agenda, even if it's, this is what we want to the tune of 3 policies as a spearhead. But the weak, cowardly, backwards position where you accept the argument of the people that are against your interests is astonishing to me, and it's befuddling. We need patriots, not cowards. And this is the moment to do it. If Donald Trump is indeed a maniac and is going to end America, that argument is still true for Democrats also. Are you really going to not appropriate on policies for America and allow that maniac to destroy the world? You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas, and Stranahan will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C. or 102.7 in Kansas City. Octoon, baby.
Five two 1320. We're also telling you where you can find us briefly. If you want to listen to us on the air in DC, if you live in that area, you can catch us there on the radio. We're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If, on the other hand, you're in Kansas City, you can listen to us there, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Oh, and we're online, audio-wise. You can catch us Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. We're also available by video over on YouTube. Just do a quick search for Jamarl Thomas. You'll see his channel, his bright and smiling face every morning, and my monotonal gray face also smiling, I suppose, there most mornings. In addition to that, you can.
I'm asking for another picture, by the way. I don't want people to think that I don't want people to think I'm taking a dig at you. I've asked Shane for another picture. I was like, dude, give me another picture.
No, I totally.
Picture. And we're going to get your video at some point.
That'd be fantastic. No, I need to work that stuff out on my end. Totally. No, it's not Jamarl's fault. Really, the ball's in my court on that one. Totally. I need to trim my beard is the thing. That's frankly what it comes down to. And all the I brought this up once in the hour before. All the barbershops are closed down, man. And I've tried to trim my beard once, and I just didn't like how it came out. So I don't know.
Wait. You're in California, right? You're in California. You're in California.
I'm in California. Exactly.
There's one that's open. There's one that's open. Call Pelosi. Call Pelosi. There's one salon that's open.
That's right. Well, here's the thing: is that for a brief second, I forget exactly when I went to try. I think it was early in June. Like the lockdown had kind of lightly been lifted, and I was willing to take a risk. Okay, I'm going to go out and do this. Let me see what the options are. But I literally couldn't do it because they want you to wear a mask the entire time. And that's completely understandable, but like I want my beard trimmed. And you get my point. How are you supposed to trim a beard while you're wearing a mask? It's impossible, impractical. Anyway, we are taking calls 202-521-1320. First off, I wanted to come back on your monologue real quick. This is something we talk about all the time, so I'm not gonna take too much time to do this one. It's just yes, the Democratic Party and party politics in general. If you don't have accountability, if you don't have any feedback mechanism, then you're not doing democratic politics. You're effectively doing oligarchy. You're doing oligarchic politics with a sort of superficial veneer of democracy, some light little interface layer where people get to nominally participate in your political system. That's what we have.
Just no.
no qualms about it. Yeah, that's exactly what we have. And I don't, it's not a democracy anymore. That's an oligarchy and a managed, propagandized republic. I don't,
And
that's
I
what
don't
that
think,
is. So
I don't think I'm being unfair on that. Like it's not, that assessment doesn't come from this notion of oh, he's saying that of some level of just being spiteful. No, prove me wrong. I mean, ultimately, I'm looking at a candidate with 70% of the people say they don't like, and another guy who they consider to be the end of the world, and like the most radical of us. Like for example, we accept a ludicrous proposition where a Democrat will come to us and say, "Look, we are offering you poverty and everything that entails. Think of everything that entails. Think of the drama, the violence, the crime, the desperation, the suicides, the younger death rate, all that stuff. Think of all of that stuff, the horrible aspects of poverty. Quantify it and put a D beside it. This is what we're going to give you. And that's going to be less than what Republicans who are going to give you poverty quantified by a coefficient of R. Which one do you want?" Now, that's a horribly ludicrous proposition. And you see what happens in these places where things blow up based on the policies of that D coefficient as opposed to an R coefficient. Meaning it didn't matter. Like in the grand scheme of things, you move still further and further to the right, regardless of that D coefficient of poverty. It's like a one concentration camp less argument. And they want you to accept that. And everything that entails in regards to your society, everything that deals with regarding to various communities in your society, they just want you to accept it. And they're saying, like, look, we're a better version of that. And I'm saying you should not accept that. I mean, there's a point where you let them fail, right? I mean, if I'm having a conversation with you, Shane, and I say, is there any point where you would allow, where you would have to vote for that? Like where you would just let them drop, like where whoever Trump is on the side, is there any point where you would say, okay, fair enough, I won't vote for that? And you say no. Then how can you tell me we're in a representative government? We're not. It's like the process gets rigged.
That's the thing.
Yeah, the process is rigged.
100%. No, it is rigged, and here's the thing: is it's rigged in the weird way that like. Again, it's not rigged in the sense that there's one puppet master. It's rigged in the sense that there are a bunch of people who have way, way, way more power than any group of voters, let alone a single voter, but any, organized group, cohort within our representative democracy. You have people who have way more power than the vast majority of other people, obviously. And it's just what we're living in. Again, there are different ways we could analyze the problem. It's just I've seen it this way for a long time. I'm so deeply steeped in seeing it this way. And trying to find other ways of seeking political change and then focusing on those things. It's sort of like coming back. I don't know. It's like it's years since I've been here. It's almost nostalgic.
And the public accepts
feeling
it.
This kind of skepticism anew.
And the public accepts it. That's the catch.
Well,
the public accepts it.
I don't know what you mean by that exactly. What is the public's response to go out and
they go out and they vote for Joe?
Because even if they do,
I see what you mean.
You see these crimes of despair. You see individual people. If individual people are responding to society, but even then you get this first mover problem. It doesn't. The public accepts it. The public doesn't accept it. The public doesn't have to accept it because there's no engagement. Again, if there's only that tiny bit of engagement, if that's what you mean by accept, is going into the polling box with less and less frequency as the years go on.
That's true, but I'm saying you get people who will still go out and say you got to vote for Joe Biden. If that is not internal, I don't know what that is. Because they don't have to make that argument. Like the argument cuts both ways. If you're going to say Joe Biden is a maniac, Trump is a maniac, Trump goes to end the world, he's going to end America. Well, the same argument goes the other side. It's like, well, yeah, but are you telling me that you're not going to appropriate policies that the majority of America backs in order to stop that maniac? Meaning, you could take that argument either way. They have internalized this to such a degree that they don't believe in the things that they talk about. Like, they've internalized the Democratic argument. And based on their argument, there is no situation where the policies that they say they believe in can ever come to fruition. And so they believe that this is the best that they can get. The Fukuyamas. But in a deep-spirited way, despite what they say. That's where we are, and that's sad. Like I don't know. I don't think people realize how profoundly sad that is. But that's where we are.
It is, yeah.
Because they don't have to do that.
We can talk about this forever.
Right. Tarif in New Orleans.
Tarif,
what's going on, man?
From New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. I got 3 comments. I saw Bill Bennett yesterday on the LaRouche Pack. They was on Reddit, and they got to a point where they brought up Neuralinks. I know this is the 3rd time for me bringing it up. They say they got to the point where not only they can put signals inside your head, put thoughts in your head, but they got to the point where they can read the signals, which means read your mind. And that brought me a mind of a person that's chipped against their will, and they go out to the store and buy groceries or go eat. And then if they try to get rid of that person, then they can, tamper with the groceries, tamper with the restaurant food, where that person becomes sicker and sicker, or they put poisons in the food where it make that person paranoid or angry or delusional and whatnot. So my other 2 comments is dealing with the ACLU.org. In 2011, Barack Obama, I just found this out yesterday, signed the NDAA into law. Basically is like canceling your civil rights, and people wonder why the federal troops can scoop you off the street. It's because they are protected by something that was signed in 2011. The NDAA section 1021 and 1022. What's his name? Jimmy Dole brought it up yesterday. Matter of fact, I heard it before then too, but I had forgot about it. And the last thing is dealing with China. Earlier this year, the Chinese researchers created a prototype plasma jet engine in a lab, which means it can run off electricity in air. And I think they can move it to like space travel too, which is a good thing. It can help deal with pollution. I linked those links to your tweet today. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Tarif. I appreciate the call, man. The Neuralink thing is interesting to me. The putting thoughts in people's heads stuff I'm not quite sure about. I would say this. Of course, your government is doing research into, let's say, analyzing thoughts or control. I mean, that stuff was done in the 70s with some of the LSD experiments. But it's a difference of whether or not it's in play in large parts, in large measure. Look, I don't know. I don't know what's behind the scenes. A lot of that stuff is in black, so who knows? The Neuralink stuff, it fascinates me, though, to no end. And it fascinates me because, if it's seductive, and it will be seductive, and it will be so seductive that you're going to look up in 50 years and people are going to have that thing in their heads all the time. Because what's going to happen, mark my words, write this video down. Write this video down, it sounds weird, but you know what I mean. They're going to say, look, this thing is going to help your blindness. And they're just going to say, what? You can help my blindness? Well, of course, I don't want to be blind. This thing can help your hearing. This thing can help you with some mental issue that you have, and it's going to make you a better person. And they're going to say, oh, by the way, there's a side effect where you could remember a little bit more than you could prior. There's a side effect that you could see farther with your blindness being fixed, that you could hear better, that you could remember all of these things saved in a file that you could use anytime you want. And they're going to say, really? Now, people, normies, as we're going to be called, are going to say, well, wait a minute. I could get something like that, and I could expand my vision, even if I don't have a problem? Yes. I could expand my thinking capacity, even if I don't? Yes. And they're going to do that. And jobs are going to say, wow, we like those people who could do that, and start having somewhat of a bias implicit towards those people. And you're going to have normies, competent in every other way, losing out to people who have those particular faculties. I am telling you, this is what's coming. And
that's how technology works. Yeah, that's how it is. And that's the slippery slope argument coming into play. That's the incentive. That's the technological incentive. There's this book that influenced me, a kind of little known book. I'm not saying it's a great book that everybody should read. I'm just throwing it out there more as a hat tip. The Parable of the Tribes. I read this a long time ago, and it's interesting book. Just kind of influenced my thinking. And one of the key ideas there, he's using tribes as a parable, but this idea that if you have some new edge, some new competitive edge, military or however it is, even if it's oppressive, even if it's some social form of organization that's oppressive within your society that just makes you as a tribe more powerful, other tribes will come to imitate that. Other tribes will come to adopt that technique. And so like becomes like. What makes you more powerful over time, other people tend to adopt. And there's this degrading process of I don't know, dehumanization that I'm worried about with different forms of technology. But I don't know what to do. It's just this endemic, axiomatic problem, something we can always talk about. We're going to go into a break. We will be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thanks for listening. And Tarif, thanks for the call.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Mercouris. We are joined by Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. Alexander, how are you doing this morning?
I'm very well and delighted to be with you again.
I'm delighted to have you joining us. Thank you again for taking the time. Alexander Mercouris, as I just mentioned, is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. That's spelled TheDuran.com. You can check them out, at that website, theduran.com. You can also follow them on Twitter. Go to twitter.com/theduran_com. So like you're going to their website on Twitter, except instead of a period, you have that underscore. Anyway, Alexander, thank you for being with us. We're talking about British politics and what's going on over in Belarus. I actually, for just a second, I want to start with that second one. What is going on in Belarus? Since last we spoke, I believe, the EU voted to not accept Lukashenko's election results. Mm-hmm. And then as we were reporting just a couple of days ago, we're seeing poll workers coming out saying that they were pressed to give fraudulent vote counts, basically pressed to give summary documents that didn't represent vote totals before voting had completed. Basically, again, this is the first sort of witness. This is the first testimony I've heard that there was fraud going on in this election. But of course, everybody was suspicious with Lukashenko winning 80% majority. That just reeks of voter fraud. So we were asking the question, not assuming it, but asking the question whether this was going on. So this has happened in the past couple of weeks. Obviously, you've been paying close attention to this issue. Yeah. What do you think's going down right now? What do you think Lukashenko's prospects are? What's your take on the situation,
right,
Alexander?
I don't think that anybody has ever had any real doubt that those results were faked to some degree. The only question is to what extent. And I've gradually come to the view that though fraud did undoubtedly take place and he did not get 80% of the vote or anything like that, he probably came ahead with at least a plurality, perhaps even a majority of the votes in the election. But perhaps more interesting and more pertinent is to look at the situation on the ground in Belarus now. And in fact, it's interesting that there seems to be a gradual stabilization of the situation there. There was an attempt to get strikes organized in all the big factories, the big state-owned factories, and for a time it looked as if that might happen. But those strikes have completely petered out, and it seems all the factories are now working normally again. And Lukashenko has managed to get increasingly clear support from the Russians, and the protests themselves, which had been fairly aggressive at one point and rather passionate, have now dwindled to essentially one big protest every weekend on a Sunday, and one gets the impression that it's the same people turning up. So it looks as if for the moment the situation is stabilizing, and that Lukashenko's position is a bit stronger than it looked as if it might be a few weeks ago. My overall feeling is that nonetheless, his period is gradually coming to a close, that the Russians are now more actively involved on the ground in Belarus. They've even sent people to basically run the television service there. And they've invited Lukashenko to Moscow. He's going to go there in a short time, perhaps next week, and he's going to meet Putin, and there's talk about a new constitution. And I think the Russians are going to gradually work towards some kind of transition with a new political system in Belarus, peeling off some of the opposition, and keeping Belarus within their geopolitical orbit. So I think this is where we are at the moment. There's still potential for things to go wrong. There was an attempt apparently about 10 days ago to storm the presidential headquarters, but that apparently was called off when the people who went to storm it found large numbers of riot police and security forces there, and it was not attempted last weekend. So I get the sense that the thing is gradually now abating.
You know, Alexander, this is elegant politics. I love this. I'm always fascinated by politics when you look at it from a third person and you're not involved in it. Basically, my argument, I think, a few weeks ago was that Russians could not allow Belarus to fall into hands or into any kind of way where the EU can get involved or where other countries can get involved, meaning they had to keep it within their sphere. They can't have that turning into a Ukraine. And so, but that didn't necessarily mean war. That just meant involvement in some way. And in this case, the thought is, all right, we're going to have this guy escorted out elegantly. But we're also going to give a bone to the public itself to say, look, we're going to change this to be more in line with your liking, meaning we hear your protests. And even though we're not going to give you everything you want, we're going to give enough of what you want to give rid of some of the opposition off the streets. Meaning how many ever people come out on those weekends, we want that number to be less. That's basically what's taking place. I mean, this is basically politics that's done almost, even though it's within the context of Belarus, it's being done almost pushed at the behest of the Russian government.
I think that's exactly right. There was a fascinating interview that Putin gave a couple of days ago in which he disclosed that the Russians have put together what he called a reserve force of law enforcers. That's almost certainly from the Russian National Guard, which would be activated in the event that any administrative buildings were seized. As I said, that was undoubtedly provoked by the attempt to storm the presidential headquarters, which was, as I said, abortive. But in that same interview, Putin also said that the concerns of the protesters needed to be taken into account. I think the Russians understand very well that the present Lukashenko system has exhausted itself. Lukashenko has been there for 26 years. He stabilized Belarus in the 1990s when everything else throughout the rest of the Soviet Union was falling apart. Former Soviet Union was falling apart. He's kept it clean of corruption. But he maintained a political and economic and administrative order, which is now, I think, simply no longer of a kind that meets the interests of Belarusian society. So I think the Russians understand that, and I think they understand that it's got to change, and Lukashenko has to gradually be edged out. And he seems to understand it too, by the way. But obviously, their overriding concern is to keep this thing, Belarus, within their geopolitical sphere. It's very interesting also to look at the opposition, because I think what has happened in Belarus, and this is what has made this a little confusing and difficult to understand, is that on the one hand, there is a great deal of exhaustion and frustration with Lukashenko, and lots of young people have been coming out and they've been protesting against him because they want change in Belarus, and these are legitimate and genuine protests, and they're overwhelmingly peaceful protests. But on top of that, and parallel to it, there's also been the regime change elements, which are probably no more than a few thousand people And it seems they've been the ones who've been trying to organize the violence. There was apparently an attempt to create a tent city, Maidan style in Minsk in the first few days after the election, and who wanted to storm the headquarters and to bring the people out on strike. So there are two quite distinct groups of people involved. And what the Russians are trying to do is, I think they're looking for ways to detach the mass of people who are tired of Lukashenko, want to see change, but don't want to see a breakdown or a revolution, from the sort of more hardline, militant, pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU, colour revolution activists who probably number no more than a few hundred or perhaps a few thousand. And I think they're succeeding. I think that this policy, this strategy they've been following, which is very careful and very carefully worked out and thought through, for the moment seems to be working. There was a furious article, by the way, in the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, a few days ago by none other than John Bolton, remember him, in which he made exactly that point and talked about the prospects for freedom in Belarus slipping away, and criticized Donald Trump and the European Union for not pursuing an even more aggressive policy. So that says to me that this operation, the colour regime part of it, is failing, but the longer-term changes in Belarus are nonetheless coming.
Alexander, do you see any hint that Lukashenko has found or is looking for a successor or an heir? That seems like that would be the way out here.
He hasn't found a successor or an heir because his entire policy up to now has been to concentrate power in himself and to lead Belarus for as long as he possibly can. He doesn't want successors or heirs because successors and heirs can become potential rivals. That's been the problem. He's created something of a political desert around himself. Now, there are very, very capable people. There's a very capable technocratic elite within Belarus running the factories. It's got a very advanced IT industry. It's by no means, a museum place. It's actually a very well-run country. But he's restricted, he's narrowed power and centralized it within himself to an extraordinary degree. What needs to happen, what the Russians want to do, is they want to open up the political system so that there are more voices and more people that they can work with. And that's what all this talk about a new constitution is all about. So the idea is that Lukashenko will remain president for a while, but power will then be transferred increasingly to the government. There will be more people. The parliament will be made stronger. There'll be more people, brought in who can develop their own ideas, and gradually Lukashenko will be shifted aside. And perhaps in a year or two, when all things have died down and the new leadership has emerged, he will gradually step away and fade into a respectable and dignified retirement. I think that's the Russian plan.
If he goes out in that way, meaning if they're going to kind of escort him out in that way, what's the expectation coming back for that? And one more thing, in fact, scratch that question. If I'm walking through Belarus today, just regular tours, what would it look like to me? And we have about 30 seconds. But if I was just walking through, what would it look like? I mean, you said it's a well-run country. They call it the last dictatorship of Europe. But in saying that, it gets across two things. That A, it is a European country with everything that entails from the standpoint of a point of view of what a European country looks like. Mm-hmm. But it also is not in an odd way. So what would it look like if I was just traveling as a tourist through Belarus?
It's a stable, very law-abiding, rather materially stable country. People are not hugely rich, but there's not very much poverty, and most people have jobs, and it's very orderly and very clean. And if you went to the cities, you'd find little graffiti or anything like that. And it's typical of the protesters themselves. I mean, they don't break glasses, windows. There's been no rioting. It's all been very peaceful, apart from the small number of people who have not been. And yes, I think that Lukashenko has been an authoritarian leader. He's accepted it, even to some extent a dictator. But there's not large numbers of people in prisons. There's no torture chambers. There's no secret killings. There's nothing like that. It's actually a very law-abiding, very orderly, rather affluent place, open up to great extent to the outside world. People have been able to travel. They're able to read Western media. It's a little bit of a backwater, but by no means an unpleasant place at all. I haven't been there myself. My wife goes there regularly, and that's her description of it.
Very interesting.
Alexander, we'll be back in a minute. Yeah, thank you for that, giving us that description. We'll be back in a minute. That was the voice of Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you again in a minute.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at theduran.com. We were talking about Belarus. Look, I love the politics of this stuff. Part and parcel to what got me into watching European Parliament, or for that matter, British Parliament. What's the politics of it? Because you can look at it from a third-person perspective in a way that you don't have it like it digging in you from the standpoint of being in it, if that makes sense. Alexander, I want to jump to the UK for the moment. Last I paid attention to the UK when I was really uberly focused on it. Boris Johnson was basically god of the political circus, meaning it didn't seem like there was opposition to him all that much. Even, I remember Boris Johnson lost like 7 votes in a row, and the public still was like, this is our guy. And it was like, yeah, that guy's going to win. And after he won, everything fell apart. And it still looked like Boris Johnson was able still to carry the public's consensus. But now I check back, and it seems that Labour has taken a turn in the polls. Starmer, the guy who was offering only himself to the UK, is now apparently bolted in the polls. What happened in the intervening time period?
Boris Johnson's extraordinary managerial incompetence has caught up with him. I think it's universally accepted, even by his friends, that he has badly mishandled the pandemic crisis in Britain. I mean, Britain, you can't get the exact figures, but perhaps 60,000 British people have died during the pandemic, which is an awfully high number. On top of that, there's been constant changes of direction and changes of policy, and recently we've had a total debacle about the arrangements for the end-of-year examinations for 18 students of the 18-year-old cohort who rely on those examinations to go to university, and that whole thing has been catastrophically mismanaged. In addition, Johnson himself has come across as a very detached and disorganized leader. There was a really rather dreadful parliamentary performance yesterday, which was embarrassing to watch, actually, from Johnson. And he doesn't seem to be, very focused or really all there, and doesn't really give very much the impression of being in control. So I think there's been a draining away of confidence in Johnson and in the Conservative Party. And that has inevitably led to a sort of rise in support for the Labour Party. But I'm actually going to be a bit more critical of the Labour Party. It seems to me that a more forceful opposition, given the collapse of the government's authority over the last few weeks, ought to be doing even better than this one is. And I remember way back in 1992, when we had a very similar election outcome at the start of the year, with the Conservatives winning the 1992 election very unexpectedly. And then it went on, and there was a major political crisis and an economic crisis over the course of that year, with the pound sterling dropping out of the European exchange rate mechanism, great sense of humiliation and anger in the country, as there is now, and a sense of the government not being fully in control. And at the end of that year, Labour was 22 points ahead in the polls. So they didn't just, equalise the polling levels with the Conservatives. They actually surged far ahead. And that has not happened. I mean, Starmer and Labour have recovered up to a certain point, but the Conservatives are still either ahead or level pegging with them. And that is really interesting, and it begs the question why. And I think the reason why is that Labour at the moment are not providing much in the way of a credible alternative, except to say, well, we're actually more administratively capable than Johnson, and not providing very much of an alternative vision. Whereas in 1992, they did. So Johnson is down, the Conservatives are down, there is a widespread sense of malaise, there's a feeling that the government isn't really doing very well, but I don't get the sense of huge enthusiasm for Labour either.
It's kind of like here in the United States. I mean, basically, Starmer is saying, I give you, I am all that I have to give. Like, you're going to accept me because I'm not them. You guys have arrived to the point that we are, where basically it's right. You're not voting for what you want. You're voting entirely just to get the other guy out of office, which means you've lost all leverage in the political system. I find that to be astonishing. Do they have polling that asks, like, are you voting for this person to get the other guy out of office, or are you voting for this person because you like that person? Like, do you have those type of polling in the UK?
Not really, not to anything like the extent or the sophistication that you do in the United States. Though I think one thing I would say is that I tend to trust the polls in Britain more than I trust some of the polls I see in the United States. I get the sense that polling agencies in the United States, on both sides, by the way, have become pretty partisan. So, Rasmussen will always build up Trump, and some of the others will always, support Biden. So I think polling in Britain is more honest, but it's at the same time rather less sophisticated. So I don't think we've really got there, because I think you're absolutely right, by the way, that it's not the situation bears an astonishing resemblance to the United States. I think Starmer is a rather more serious candidate in a sense than Biden is, because he's obviously a highly effective forensic lawyer with great training, and he's at peak physical health, and nobody doubts mental agilities and all those things. But at the same time, there's no real enthusiasm for him. There's no sense that he's, the man of the future. He's the person to take Britain forward. He's got a vision of what to do that people find compelling or interesting. And exactly as happened in the United States, when, the sort of more left side of the Democratic Party was sidelined and pushed into the fringes.
Right.
Same thing happened in Britain with the Labour Party.
Alexander, that's the point. They have nowhere else to go. Right exactly. There.
Well, this is it. That's it. Yeah. So it's you're left with, this bureaucratic, centrist holdover, which gives no enthusiasm, appears to provide continuity, but is somehow marketed, if you like, as less bad, significantly less bad than the chaos that you see on the other side.
Exactly.
So it's not really a good political situation, I think, because Britain, like the United States, has profound problems. It needs a strong, pair of hands in charge, somebody who has a clear view of where to go and how to deal with things, and who's also got real managerial skills. And we don't have that at the moment. I mean, we've had that in the past. I was recently reading about the kind of Labour Party that existed in the 1940s and 1950s, which had a clear vision of the way it wanted to take Britain forward. Even the Conservatives at that time were a much more well-run and capable party. And they did have that combination of managerial skills and, ideological vision, and we have nothing like that at the moment. We have an exhausted technocracy, if you like, within the Labour Party, and a completely chaotic and dysfunctional populist group of right-wing people who don't really know what they're doing most of the time in the Conservative Party. And I get the sense that very many people in Britain are very disillusioned with all this.
Do you think that the situations will play out or will transpire in the same way on either side of the Atlantic? How do you think? I mean, where do you think this is going in Britain and in the United States?
Very good question. I mean, the great problem is, I think that to some extent, as in the US, but in Britain too, we had with this Corbyn movement, this tremendous movement that did energise and provide huge enthusiasm for many people, and did at one time seem like it was going to offer a real alternative. Its failure has left many people very exhausted and very disillusioned and very demoralised. And I think it's going to be very difficult to put something like that together again, actually. So the problem is there's a vacuum of real politics at the centre and real enthusiasm around that politics, and a lack of engagement. And the result is a general sense of drift with no very clear sense of where things are going to go. In some parts of the UK where, alternatives do exist, like Scotland, what that is doing is that it's making a lot of Scottish voters, especially younger Scottish voters, say, well, this is such an exhausted political system that, frankly, we're better out of it entirely. And they're, as a result, opting for independence of Scotland in ever larger numbers, because they say, well, the Westminster system is simply incapable of providing us with any way forward. So that's I think, a real possibility now that we'll see Scottish secession. What that effect that is going to be in England, I don't know. Whether it's going to galvanise people in England, as some people think, or whether people have become so cynical and so disillusioned, I don't know. The other thing, of course, is Britain is now looking at a very severe economic recession. Unemployment is apparently rising fast. There's talk that the government is going to have to raise taxes in the autumn. So it may very well be that once all that hits in the autumn, well, we're almost in the autumn now, but when it starts to hit in the next few weeks' time, that will also begin to change the political climate. Johnson himself has said that Britain is in for choppy waters.
30.
It's a usual euphemism for, playing down, in a sense, the gravity of the situation. But it may be that, if there's a major surge in unemployment again, if people losing their jobs, that may give people an incentive to start taking a more active role in politics than they have been up to now.
Alexander Mercouris.
That's the hope I think we all have. Yeah, Alexander Mercouris, thank you for joining us. We've got to go. Alexander is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. We'll be back in a minute with another 2 hours of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner and on the West Coast, I am your investigative political analyst and radio talk show co-host, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the top headlines in the news. The United States imposed sanctions on the ICC officials over a probe into war crimes in Afghanistan, specifically going after ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda and the ICC head's jurisdiction, complementary and cooperation division, Bushako. This has to do with the United States is not party to the ICC. However, Afghanistan is, and because Afghanistan is, they have jurisdiction over that particular area. The United States has balked at that, and in balking at that has basically imposed sanctions on people who are investigating crimes that our soldiers committed in Afghanistan. Protests erupts in Rochester, New York after police released body cam footage on Wednesday showing Rochester officers handcuffing Daniel Prude, placing a hood over his head, pressing his face into the pavement until he is silent. Daniel's brother called the police for help because Daniel was having mental health issues. In the video, medics performed CPR on Prude before loading him into the ambulance. Prude died 7 days later on March 30th. The autopsy report for the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office said his cause of death included, quote-unquote, complications of asphyxia in the setting of physical restraint. Vice presidential candidate Joe Biden is traveling to Kenosha, Wisconsin today. While there, he's expected to meet with the family of Jacob Blake, the 29-year-old man who was shot in the back, triggering protests and some rioting in the city. Biden's visit comes 2 days after Trump's visit. President Trump is going after funding for the mayors of states he's saying is being soft on crime. In a tweet yesterday, he said the administration will, quote, do everything in its power to prevent weak mayors and lawless cities from taking federal dollars while they let anarchists harm people, burn buildings, and ruin lives and businesses. We're putting them on notice today, unquote. He then tagged the Director of Office Management and Budget. This follows a week-long back and forth between President Trump and Mayor Ted Wheeler of Portland, including a tweet earlier in the night in which the president mocked Wheeler. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is advising states that a vaccine will likely be ready on November 1st. In a letter to governors, hospitals and health departments will be the first recipients of the vaccine. Tom Seaver has died. The American baseball pitcher, also known as Tom Terrific and the franchise, played for the New York Mets, Cincinnati Reds, Chicago White Sox, and Boston Red Sox from 1967 to 1986 before he was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame by the highest percentage of votes ever recorded. Seaver had suffered from memory problems for years and was diagnosed with dementia in 2019, formally withdrawing from public life. He passed away in his sleep from combined consequences of dementia and COVID-19. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the deficit will reach $3.3 trillion, more than triple last year, and the largest gap since World War II. Puts the United States in a class of countries, including Japan, Greece, and Italy. And we don't have universal health care. We don't have an expansion of Social Security. We don't have a Green New Deal. We don't have any of that stuff. Where's your money going? Is a fair question to ask. The University of South Carolina is reporting more than 1,200 COVID infections, with more than 100 new cases each day since the school reopened 2 weeks ago. The infection rate was reportedly 28% as of last week. The university has cracked down on off-campus parties, but has no plans to cancel in-person classes. That is going to go monstrously well. France is announcing a multi-billion-dollar recovery plan, including a plan to hire 160,000 people to, among other things, build green tech transportation, more housing, and to promote social cohesion. France is pitching social cohesion. I love that last point. The reason that they're calling it social cohesion is because what they realize is when you have a lot of poverty in the country, when people don't have jobs, when people don't have opportunities, they turn to other things in order to make ends meet. And sometimes those things are not necessarily in the best interest of the society. The alienation of, let's say, the poverty and whatnot can be ameliorated to some degree by bringing those people back into the community, by allowing those people to have opportunity. That's basically what they're saying, and they're going to do it using green tech. Yes, that's a great idea. A typhoon is hitting South Korea today, taking down power to nearly 300,000 homes. Meanwhile, Japan's Coast Guard is searching for a livestock ship that was supposed to have capsized in the storm. The ship was carrying 43 members of the ship's crew as well as 6,000 head of cattle from New Zealand to China. Only one member of the crew has been rescued so far. That is very grim. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, the budget office thing is interesting. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I think it's a fair question to ask. And look, sometimes I'm bothered by a perception of the news that we do, right? Because the news that we're doing is just straight news. This is honest. Whatever network we're on, this news is what it is. And if you asked us, wherever we were, we would say the exact same things that we're saying now. $3.3 trillion. What are you getting for your cash? Think about all the things that are bothersome in your world, in your society. And think about all the things that you would want to get done. Policies. Not far to the left, not far to the right, as people will call it. Just policy. Ask America, what do you want, America? And America says, we want this. And the reality of it is, oftentimes, what they want is to the left of the Democratic Party and certainly to the left of the Republican Party. What Alex McCurris was saying, he was basically making the point, the left has just been cowed. Now, the left in Britain has been to some degree resurgent. I mean, after all, they took power when they were leader of the opposition. So they at least got further gains than they had in the United States, ever, at least for the last 40, 50 years. But he's saying that now it's to the point that Boris Johnson has gotten so out of sorts that Starmer, the guy who nobody liked, no enthusiasm for, all of a sudden gets a bump. And how sad that is, because now that means that the left can get cowed. If Starmer wins, then Starmer is like, hey, we're back in business. And then you got the centrist, nothing of a candidate, inert candidate, as you would say, Shane, that's in power. And the left, who had the enthusiasm, had the momentum, that wasn't. Not for anything that Starmer did, entirely for what Boris Johnson was and represented. Their own little mini Trump. How sad is that? I'm trying to get the point into people's heads that it is not the responsibility of them to get the candidate in office. It's not. It is not at all. There is nothing that compels you to do that. And the fact that you have so many people that left the political space tells you that's true. It is their job to get your vote. That's sad. $3.3 trillion. Think about what that money could have achieved. Think about what that money could accomplish. You're talking about Green New Deal. You're talking about expansion of Social Security. All of those lefty priorities that the American public said, this is what we want. That you would think if you had a party, especially to the left, that say, hey, we're receptive to that. We're going to give you what you want, America, because we want your vote. We want to get enthusiasm and win. That's not the way your political system works. That is the way a government would work if indeed it was attentive to the needs of the public. That's a representative government. You have something else. You need to get that into your heads. In this very specific instance, though, $3.3 trillion of your cash has gone to something, somewhere. To who? I think you need to answer that question. You need to ask yourself that, because it didn't go to you, and it didn't necessarily go to keep these businesses open. It didn't necessarily go to ensure that you had health care. It didn't go to think of any of your priorities. It didn't go there. It went somewhere else. That number is astonishing. If I'm not mistaken,
some of it
Shane,
literally did.
Wait. If I'm not mistaken, this is more than what we were making from the standpoint of the entire U.S. economy for this year. Am I insane in that? Did I misread that somewhere?
No. That's the thing, is that it's passing GDP, and it's very close to it, and they're predicting that it's going to pass it. The other, I just wanted, technically, some of that money did go to us. So literally, just from a factual standpoint, and not enough of it, definitely. You can argue with where the money went, and I would, but between the stimulus package and unemployment grants, a bunch of that money technically did get dispersed to people, to the average American citizen. So that did happen. Yeah, I don't mean to make too much of that, but just factually.
But there was a tax cut
should have been
before
more.
any of this. Like, there was that Trump tax cut, where that money went to the top, the overwhelming majority. And even with this, like
it's
you
true,
said,
but
the 1,200.
I hear you. No, and if you're shifting the pie up, another way to see this is if you have a fixed pie. I don't know that that's the right way to view this, but take for a second, if we assume for a second that the economy is so stagnant on a deep level, which I don't know that we can, but maybe just if we do for a second, assume that it's a fixed pie, and you're redistributing that pie, and you're predominantly redistributing it to the wealthy, that you could maybe see this that way. But just technically, money was given to people. The tax cut did disproportionately benefit the wealthy, but it also benefited the poor too. But again, it's just the ratio is one way of looking at it.
No, I agree.
On
with
the
that.
other hand,
wait, don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to make the argument that no money went to the public. Like, that's not what I was trying to get at. I'm making the point that the skew is so off and out of whack. For example, when Trump did that tax cut, and the people said, "Yeah, you guys did great with it, right?" And it's like, "Yeah," and they said, "How much?" And so you got like $2 extra at the end of the week. Now that's obscene, considering that this other guy probably got $500 million. And they would sell it. They would say, "Hey, we got you that tax cut, right? That tax cut that got you, $20 at the end of the year," as opposed to the $500 million, which is entirely what it was for. Even though they're selling it to you, it's not for you. It's not for you. The skew on it is so off and out of whack. Like, I think that's the point that I'm trying to make. It's not so much that I'm saying nothing went to you. I'm saying that the tiny bit that went to you is a fig leaf for what they want to go to somebody else.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Yeah, it was literally the other thing. I'm just sort of guarding against potential attacks or something like that. But I agree with that completely. The skew is way off. We're taking calls, by the way, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. We've got somebody on the line. I want to real quick just throw this thing in. I was just thinking about this, and I realized I could support pretty much any quote unquote a lot of these lefty policies, at least any lefty policy that's like trying to increase the size and scale of the government, trying to solve society's problems by replacing what business would be doing.
Yes.
I would support a lot of that stuff if there were some way to keep it from becoming a situation of rent seeking. And that's a very specific thing with a specific definition. Just this idea that if you create a sort of way of making money or of accruing power, or if you create a system that provides goods and gets something in return for those goods, and people are benefiting from presiding over that system, whether it's in a capitalist society, a socialist economy, whatever form it's in, if it turns into that kind of oppressive relationship where somebody is just extracting rents, that's a bad situation. Now, the thing is that can happen in a capitalist economy.
Yes.
If you have a monopoly, or if you have regulatory capture, where you have a government that the corporation is using to sort of work its ends, that same exact thing happens. This is an ideological argument. I guess I almost had an epiphany where it sort of clarified my view of things.
Just make it public. Meaning,
I could see that with some things. That's the thing.
Like, for example, power.
I'm completely open to that conversation.
Yeah, like power, for example. If you say, "All right, look, we need to have control of our power systems. We don't like this idea that these guys are making cash off the power system. So we're going to make this a public ownership thing, where the public itself owns it, works it, does what it needs to do. That way we're not overbearing in it. And you can do that for all sorts of stuff, whether it's water, power, whatever. Let's go to the break, and we're going to come back with callers. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. You can, if you guys live in the area, you can catch us in DC on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like, share this video. If you want to join the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Feel free to call. Shane, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, where you were like, look, I just don't want this to be a rent-seeking enterprise. Like, if I thought that the government actually was trying to solve a problem, like that it wasn't these other forces that was involved in the process. They just sat in a room with a lot of people who were involved in the process, the uppers, and people who were like intrinsic to making it work and say, all right, what's the best case scenario? And how do we make it better as time goes on? And they come up with a process and a plan. And your point is, I'd back that. If the government, if I thought that for real, like if I thought that their heart actually and honestly was into trying to find a real, actual solution to a problem, I would back it. Now, the catch becomes, what is it? And how do you prevent it from being rent-seeking where somebody is sitting at the top and make a thing? I would argue, make it a worker co-op or a public co-op and have the public itself doing what's necessary for that thing to work. Meaning, instead of having a bureaucrat, instead of having this kind of person who you have like a CEO and having that format, no, this will be the time to say, you know what? We're going to take control of those things, that whatever that is, and where we're going to provide this particular service, whatever that is. Let's say, for example, greenhouse. We're going to ensure that there are no food deserts in the United States. We're going to take the dilapidated factories. We're going to take those buildings that fell apart, those people that left, that were deindustrialized, and we're going to put in systems that automate food production where over the course of, X amount of time, it creates fresh food that people can get for either free or dirt cheap. Now, that would be amazing if they did that. That would be amazing if they said, all right, and we're going to leave this up to public control. So those are worker co-ops, meaning each and every one of those things are worker co-ops. And you may have a little building somewhere that helps maybe organize that stuff, but ultimately those things are controlled at the local level. It's not a political thing. It's entirely done entirely for the locality of those items. I would love that. I would love the government to direct that.
Yeah, I could get on board with that too.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, if they had control, you're talking about like worker-owned collectives or that kind of thing on a small local level.
All throughout the United States.
If they were able to do their own experimentation, if you had regional variation where people could try different stuff out, and you'd have some degree of connection with what the federal government or the state government for that matter, local governments, you'd have degrees of organization. I don't know. There are arguments to be made there. I'm totally in favor of that stuff. I think that could push everything forward. In general, the closer we can bring our society to like more experiments with better ways of doing things, and reducing the negative risks, reducing the downside risks of what could happen if we get things seriously wrong. For instance, nuclear armament. You need some mechanisms to make sure that we don't just drive ourselves directly to hell in some way through some new invention or something. But on the other end of that, like if you have more regional variation, if you have more experimentation, and then if something works, and then obviously there's opportunity to sort of spread it and emulate it on a wider level, all that stuff, that's so fascinating. If we had it, if that were where our like ideological compass as a country was pointing right now, I feel like we would be the healthiest country on the face of this earth. If by some miracle our culture shifted where that was where the conversation was, we were confident. Again, this is a little bit of a panacea, the way that I'm painting it, or something like that. It's a little bit too optimistic.
But it's not.
But I don't think
it is.
Point.
I mean, but I don't think that is too optimistic. I mean, there are two problems with that. The capitalists in your country would attack that like badger monkeys, because understand what that means. If you say, yes, I agree with that, I like the public ownership of that, you are basically taking a plank out of their playbook. Meaning, how could both of these two things exist at once? And if this one gets better, you basically undermine the notion of the CEO, the heads of these companies and everything. All of those people go away. That is a mortal threat to their existence. But however, it is also rational for society to say, yeah, I want more agency and I want more money in my job. And I want to be able to prevent my job from taking it overseas. Yeah, why do we need the head of this company? And you start asking those questions in the same way people start asking the questions, why do you need kings and queens? As if they were appointed by God. And so, like, it's an ideology thing. I guess I agree with you, Shane. And I think if you ask random people, hey, do you agree with X or Y? They would probably say, yeah. But this is a mover problem. Again, first step. But I do agree that the government should do stuff like that. I mean, I don't care what the capitalist class thinks. Go ahead.
I guess one way to look at this is I don't want to be. We've got callers, so I just want to say this, then we can go on. I wish instead of being idealistic, we were a little bit more pragmatic. But here's what I mean specifically, because I don't mean just some sort of empty pragmatism. I wish that what we focused on were like the quality of the people who are making the decisions in a very deep sense. So if you're looking at the leaders, and it's not just the words that they're using, it's not just Biden versus Trump, it's not just the rhetoric or anything like that. It's like how many of these experimental projects have they themselves overseen? Like if you have this generative churn in society where you start to make progress and then you capitalize on the people who've led those things effectively and you put them into positions of power, there's this view of things that's a little bit more neutral, that doesn't look at things as capitalism or socialism, but that just looks at people as leaders, as like, what would be the most effective person in this position to get this thing done for society? And, how can you do it? I don't know. I wish that we were having that conversation.
We don't function that way.
Instead of being stuck in this like Procruste's bed of this left-right, socialism versus capitalism thing. I can criticize capitalism. I criticize socialism all the time. But frankly, I don't care. I just want us to do better. Anyway, we've got calls.
I agree with that, by the way, Shane.
Ingrid. Thank you. All right, fault lines. Reunited through magma, I suppose, creating a new continent here. We've got Ingrid calling in from D.C. Ingrid, you're on the line. What's going on? Ingrid, I cannot hear you. There's a chance that you're muted. I'm going to try this again. Ingrid, are you there?
Yeah. I thought there were
okay, I can hear you now. Yeah, okay. What's going on?
Yeah, I'd like to address Jamarl's monologue, but first on Alexander and his comments on Belarus. I don't know if you noticed how he spoke about how the country was well run and efficient, factories were working, people had jobs, and yet he said, well, these young people have legitimate complaints, and I'm just wondering, do they have any awareness of what the rest of the world is going through at this point? And have they bought some kind of propaganda of how things would be so much better for them? Just take a look and compare their COVID-19 statistics to any other country. And they did something similar to what Sweden did. A lot of libertarians here were just all excited about Sweden. And then at the same time, mocking Belarus because Lukashenko took such a down home approach to it, but they have done better largely because they have left over this Soviet health system where they do have enough doctors and enough hospital beds and enough ability to do contact tracing and all this. So I thought it was kind of peculiar. It's like, I'm sure that Alexander's wife, if she goes there all the time, she knows more about Belarus than I do. I haven't been there since 2002, but I think it's very fishy, and it just seems like a color revolution. Now, as far as Jamarl, you really lost me with your monologue, because I don't think there's a majority of people in this country that, as you seem to think, that have some kind of agreement on what they want. And not even, I mean, you didn't even name any specifics, but take Medicare for all. Not even all the Democrats want Medicare for all.
Well, I didn't say all. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ingrid. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, you said there's policy that a majority of Americans want, and we should be able to make our candidate give it to us. And I'm saying I disagree with your basic premise that you could get a majority of Americans lined up behind anything.
Well, I mean...
That's interesting.
Well, I don't agree with that.
Yeah, Jamarl, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I want to talk about that. So, Medicare for all is 88%. Democrats, just Democrats. 70% the rest of the public. They've done that experiment twice, meaning they've run that poll twice over the course of like a year, and that poll has come back with the same thing from different agencies, by the way. You can go down the line for expansion of Social Security. The majority of Americans say, yeah, do that. That's a majority. That's a clear majority. I think it was like 70-something%. Even going for something like elimination of student debt and making public colleges free. You're talking about a majority of the population, I think it's in the 50s or the 60s, with a overwhelming majority of Democrats. My basic premise is basically, look, there are policies that people can get behind wherever they are on the political spectrum. Stand there and back those things and make your demand. Either they accept or they don't. Now, my point is, if they don't accept that, then it's proof positive that I'm right, that you don't live in a representative government, that issue is settled, that horse has left the barn. If I'm wrong, then the Democratic Party will appropriate those policies to prevent the country from sliding off the edge to oblivion, with Donald Trump taking the House, Senate, Supreme Court, and yes, the presidency. That's a checkmate. So I'm making the point that the argument cuts both ways. That if you're telling me that I'm supposed to vote for Joe Biden, I'm telling you that no, Joe Biden's supposed to get my vote if he wants to prevent oblivion. I don't see how you can argue with that, Ingrid. Are you saying that there are no issues that America agrees with?
Pretty much, yes. And
how can you say that? How can you say that? Do you refute the polling on those issues?
Did. I mean, don't ask me how I can say it. Yeah.
No, that's fair. That's fair. That's what you're saying. I'm asking you, but how can you refute the polling on those issues?
Plus, Jamarl, you wandered around for a whole long time, and then you came down to the bottom line of we have to prevent catastrophe by voting this guy out of office, which sounds
I didn't say that.
Like what you've been decrying. Well, it's what it came down to, really, at the end.
No, it didn't. I'm making the point that the argument cuts both ways. That if you are saying that this man is the apocalypse, and yet you're willing to take the country over the edge to not appropriate Medicare for all, that's insane. That's the point I'm trying to make, Trudy, that the argument that they are using, that these guys are coming around saying, oh, you got to vote for this guy, or you got to vote for that guy. They're using this argument of the apocalypse. But they're only using it in one very specific way. And lefties appropriate the wrong way. They appropriate the argument of the person who's trying to get them to vote for Joe Biden. I'm saying they shouldn't. They should appropriate the argument of the person who's saying, are you really going to not back these policies and let this guy who you're calling a monster end America? I'm framing the argument in a particular way, yes. But you've never heard me say Joe Biden is the guy to back under no... You've never heard me say that.
We've got to go into a break. Let's go into a break. We're going to come back. Ingrid calling in from DC. Ingrid, thank you for the call, as always.
Keeping us honest. Keeping us honest.
More calls, actually.
I love
yes,
it.
Exactly. I think we have time in on the other side of this break to talk to Tom and Tim pretty quickly calling in. We'll be back in a minute with them. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be speaking with Garland Nixon in just a moment, but we have a few hanging callers. I just want to get to these callers real quick. Thank you so much for waiting, guys. First up, we've got Tom calling in from Pennsylvania. Tom, sorry for the delay, but please, let's keep it pretty quick, maybe 20 or 30 seconds. What's on your mind? What are you calling about today?
Yeah, I'm calling to say that I really agree with Jamal and his position about how it's impossible for me to vote for either Trump or Biden, just as it was in 2016. And I've heard you guys talk about the Movement for the People's Party convention this weekend, but you haven't talked about the other convention for the Unity movement, the Articles of Unity.
No, Unity 2020. We have not.
Yes. So I'd like to...
No, I wanted to talk about that. We haven't... Sorry. We'll go to the next one. I'm going to go to the next caller. Thank you for the call. Just real quick, no, we haven't talked about that. This is a thing that Brett Weinstein, I mentioned Eric Weinstein, his brother, Brett Weinstein did this. And then I kind of wanted to see if we could get him as a guest because the Unity 2020 Twitter account got banned or blocked for some reason. That's happened within, I believe, the past week. It's interesting idea for a political movement. We can talk about it at some other point. But first, I think we should go to our next call so we can bring in our guest, Tim, calling in from New York. Thanks again for the call, Tom, from Pennsylvania. Tim from New York, what's on your mind in about 20, 30 seconds?
Oh, a lot of thoughts. I'm surprised. Jamarl is a little surprised that Labour in the UK is, pretty much not doing exactly the same. They're doing exactly the same thing as the Democratic Party. I think they're controlled by international oligarchs, so they're probably pulling the same scam on us. Let's see. The other thing is that Ingrid is probably wrong. Of course, you're not going to get everyone to agree with everything, but for the Democratic Party to win, they have to fight for things. Otherwise, they're going to lose a lot of the left vote, and then not may or may not win. And that's pretty much it for now in 30 seconds. But I had my head.
Tim from New York, thank you for the call. You know what?
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate that.
You want to say in response to that real quick?
No, I appreciate that. I mean, but I wasn't surprised by it. I guess I'm not surprised. Look, I always say that Labor is our darker brother. I mean, we're their darker brother. And I say that because their politics, to some degree, orbits around us. And I always decry, screaming to them, please don't allow your politics to degrade to the way that we are. But no, yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised that Labor is taking an attack that way. I mean, Starmer's horrible. It was understood when he took power what he was going to be. He was going to be a Blairite. So there's no surprise there. But fair enough. I appreciate it.
I don't mean to put too much on this, but wasn't there the same tactic? Wasn't there the same tactic used against the Bernie supporters and then against Corbyn in this sort of broad sense with identity politics, where the Corbyn campaign was
right because they kept calling him
of anti-Semitism,
right?
And
exactly.
There was the whole Bernie Bros thing where they even tried to use sexism and all this stuff.
They even tried to use that on Sanders, by the way. After the anti-Semitism thing was able to get so much legs in the UK, they turned around almost within the same week and said, that Bernie Sanders is anti-Semitic. Now, Bernie Sanders is Jewish, what makes this all the more ridiculous. And you can find videotapes of people screaming at him bloody murder because of some position he took that they didn't particularly like on Israel. Come on. It's ludicrous.
No,
But they
it's
use this as
ridiculous. It's
weapons.
ridiculous. But we should get Garland. We've got Garland on. Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That's airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern right here on Radio Sputnik. Garland Nixon. Garland, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm great. How are you, Shane?
Good. Great to have you back. We're talking about civil unrest and United States politics and the election. This sort of one big mess that we're in right now. And the next couple of months, I'm guessing, are going to be really intense. We're going to see what's happening. What do you think's going on? If you had to put on your thinking cap, your prophecying cap, where do you think our country's going in the next couple of months, Garland?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, I think that as you all probably know, on any number of mediums, ever since March when this first started, and I saw the reaction of other countries doing things to address their citizens, imposed poverty. And the U.S. didn't. I very early I said, we're going to have civil unrest. I had no idea what would trigger it at the time. I just thought, well, we'll have civil unrest and people will take to the streets over anger from economic strife. But we had a tinderbox, and I've always felt the George Floyd incident was the spark that lit a tinderbox. And I think looking now at what's happened, particularly regarding the inability of our government to renew the $600 a week unemployment bonus and to address the other issues that people are having, evictions, et cetera, I suspect it's going to get worse. We're going to talk about it as though it was only about police killings. We're going to discuss it as though it was only about what we can see right in front of our face. But bubbling below the surface is severe economic pain, which is about to turn considerably worse. I was looking at some numbers. 59% of the people of renters, 59% of renters, almost 6 out of every 10 renters in West Virginia stand to be evicted. 5 out of 10 in Louisiana. When you start looking at these kinds of numbers, it's not hard to see what's going to happen. But the interesting thing I think about it is that we only discuss it for the most part in the media, we discuss it from the perspective of what we can see in front of our face right now, which are signs that say George Floyd or Black Lives Matter or whatever, and we don't really recognize what's bubbling below the surface, and that is economic strife. I don't believe, I'll end on this, I don't believe for one second that if there was no economic pain going on right now, as a result of the inability of Congress and the White House to address these problems, that we would have the level of burning and anger and the outpouring of anger and physical anger that we have.
Garland, I'm so glad you said that. I did a video weeks ago that argued that Jacob Blake's the chaos, the rioting and everything else didn't really have much to do with Jacob Blake. I mean, it was the spark. That's true. And even the George Floyd thing, it was a spark. That's true. The George Floyd thing is interesting because of the zero tolerance that came after it. Meaning, after seeing it, you had enough people in the various areas where when something happens, there was immediate response. Whether the response was, right. I mean, meaning whether or not the killing was exactly what the public thought it was, it didn't really matter anymore. It became a zero tolerance thing. But I want to hit on this notion of what you're saying in regards to pain. I looked at Wisconsin, and I was curious about Kenosha, and I was curious about the economics. They had like 39% poverty rate in Kenosha. And I think my issue is, I agree with you. The media looks at this and says, wow, people are angry because of the police killings. Democrat looks at it and say, okay, we need to do something about the police. Now, the reality of it is those areas are dirt poor. And not just dirt poor, it's getting worse. And so they don't see, the comfortable class misses the fact that a lot of the people who are losing their homes, a lot of the people that are being evicted, a lot of the people who are ill and have to deal with those medical bills, a lot of those people are in a situation where they are in pain. And the media doesn't look at it from that situation. They only look at it from the standpoint of those people seem to be really angry about this black thing. Like, I think that makes it that much worse, because when the explosion happens, they're sitting there like, oh, wow, we don't like the fact that an explosion happens, and those people need to act differently. They need to protest differently. Missing the point that there was a lot of pain underlying that went on for months, if not years prior.
Yeah. And the other thing about protesting is, people discuss protesting as though it's logical. Well, this particular thing that the protesters are doing, it's not going to give them the outcome that they desire, as though protesting is about people sitting around with some kind of strategic plan. That ain't the way for them. Now, don't get me wrong. During the civil rights era, that is what happened. But that is the exception, not the rule. Protesting is not logical. Protesting is emotional. Protesting, as Martin Luther King said, talked about that. This is, what did he say? Riots are the voice of the unheard. These are people that are angry and are acting out. But the other thing that I think is important, and that is the long-term implications. And here's what I mean. Many of people have talked to grandparents and great-grandparents and heard stories about the Depression and how it shaped the lives of the people who lived through it. They were different. They didn't trust the banks. They hid their money. They, lots of things that they did. They hoarded every dime they could get. They became misers out of fear. What are the, and I'm going to coin this term, the children of the pandemic that are in the streets right now? What is their reality going to look like long term? I think we are creating, not we, but these dynamics are creating a generation, because if you look in the streets, first of all, if you look in the streets, they're mostly black. So the people are like, we're going to have a race war. I'm like, well, it's going to have to be white people versus white people, because the streets. Right. It's going to be this oddest race war I've ever seen. But at any rate, but these people are going to come out, and a couple of things they're going to think. When you're in trouble, the government needs to do what it needs to do to make it whole. That's why after World War II, what happened throughout Europe, they went for a lot of social democracy kind of programs, That's Medicare right. for all, things of that nature. Why is that? Because after World War II, there was no infrastructure. There was nothing. People were standing in line for the next several years. The citizens of most of Europe stood in lines waiting for their government to provide them a box of food and a few dollars, because there was no industry. They had to lean on the government. These dynamics are creating a similar a similar generation who are going to say, we expect the government to address issues when times are really hard, and they didn't do it, and we're going to make sure they do next time.
With one exception.
It's interesting to watch this generation and what they turn into.
With one exception. I mean, they were also doing it because the Soviet Union was there making the basic argument that we're going to provide for the public itself. And so Europe needed to show this kind of capitalism, and it needed to kind of, have socialistic ideas invested in it. Meaning, look, we're going to provide for the people. Yes, like you said, the war-torn cities and everything else. But also, we need to compete politically with this other institution that is basically, the antithesis of what we believe in regards to these social democracies or welfare governments.
Right.
We are tone deaf to this, though. Like, I have to be honest, I've been shocked at the level of tone deafness. I mean, they let those loans go bust. That's the first thing, right? I mean, the money that was going to people from the standpoint of employment insurance, and they acted as if that money was going and vanishing in thin air, not as if that money was going to the grocery, the baker, the person down the street when they're buying their particular whatever they're buying. That money is going somewhere, and so they made the situation that much worse. They have no sense of urgency associated with it. The evictions will take place at this point. And the executive orders that Trump signed, I've heard that there were some states that were trying to get involved in the $300. But the notion that you would even cut it to $300 gets across how out of sync you are. And Joe Biden, king of blacks and savior of a democracy itself, he is now talking about austerity programs. I don't know if you've seen this. Joe Biden is talking about, we got to have some of the, when we get in there, we're going to be broke because Trump has spent so much money. And this goes to this kind of typical shuck and jive program that these guys do, where one group will spend a ton of cash, the other group will say, hey, well, we got to cut the budget because the other people spend so much, basically enshrining what the Republicans did as opposed to trying to put through some kind of policy or some kind of agenda of your own. And so Joe Biden is going to go ahead and push through austerity. You're not going to get your public option. He's talking about additions or tweaks to Obamacare. This is madness. All right, so let's take a break. And I'm going to get your feedback on that when we get back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. With Thomas and Stranahan. We have Garland Nixon with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increase activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usually flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Joining us is Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Garland, I want to get to a topic that is close to my heart and has been a trigger point for me, actually. I've seen they've been getting to a lot of arguments with people who are typically on the left. I asked the question, where are we when our radicals cry uncle? And I think that's what we are. We had a people's convention, and the people who were in the people's convention was trying to get a new movement for a new party. Still, many of them, our radicals, come out saying, but I will be voting for Joe Biden. Now, to me, this is somewhat of a ludicrous proposition. And you can make the one concentration camp less argument, but you can even go to a lesser standard than that. Meaning, you can make the argument of poverty with a D on it, or poverty with an R on it. And my issue is, if you have a situation where your world ends up like this by voting with poverty for the D on it, maybe you need to do something different because it's not working. I mean, what we're talking about right now, the protests, the blow-ups, the zero tolerance, those things were put in place one brick at a time by Democratic administrations. The industrialization of the Midwest and the Wisconsin area. We had that caller, Julie, from yesterday, made that very basic point that the reason that you're seeing this is because they deindustrialize those areas. So issues of unemployment increase, issues of poverty increase, especially oriented around black communities. I pointed out that Wisconsin, the majority of communities in Wisconsin that are black, are in prisons or jails. This is an appalling situation that you get voting for poverty with the D on it. Which means that it's like, yes, I understand that Republicans, you may think that they're grotesque. But if your world ends up the way it is when you vote for poverty with the D on it, should you be voting for poverty with the D on it? And maybe at some point you should have taken a stand to stop them from doing that. So right now we are being presented with this case of Joe Biden as being king of blacks. And of course, it's going to go and use those families, George Floyd and Blake and whatever other person who gets killed, injured, or shot as props. How do you feel about that? I mean, you're an African American. You're, a person in this country, and regardless of being a political pundit, you still are a person that want your world to be a particular way. And you're presented with the case of Joe Biden as being the savior that all of these people are screaming that you need to vote for.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on here. The first is, in talking with people, there are a lot of people out here that just get totally flipped out. You got to vote for Biden. You got to vote for Biden. The first question is, and I've discussed this with people, how do you interpret your vote? Now, there are those of us, such as me, who interpret my vote in an assertive way. If I vote for something, I am endorsing that. Right? That's one interpretation of the vote, that my vote is towards something. My vote is towards creating something. It's asserting that I support X. So that if I vote for Trump or Biden, I'm endorsing them, and I feel culpable for whatever they do to some extent. I feel like I said that's what I want by voting it, whether or not I really wanted it or not. That's how I interpret my vote. And for a person who looks at it that way, when you look at Biden and Trump, a person like me says, I see too many things I don't like. I can't vote for either one of those people because I can't assertively endorse their particular platforms. And the other part of it is that, of course, the next argument is, well, you're not going to find any person, any candidate who you endorse their entire platform. However, I look at it like somebody who, let's say they want to date someone, right? Is there a deal breaker? Right? And someone says, well, okay, sure, I want to date that woman. She's nice, she's smart, she's attractive, she blah, 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 blah. Okay, sounds good. Oh, by the way, she's a serial killer. Oh, deal breaker. Not going out with her. Sometimes there's a deal breaker. And in the instance of Biden, with a lot of people, such as me, when it comes to the issue of war, when you look at his war cabinet surrounding him, they're not policy advisors who are surrounding him. That's a war cabinet. And a good part of it is the Bush war cabinet. So there are people who look at that and say, if I interpret my vote as endorsing something, I can't endorse that war cabinet, so I can't vote for him, regardless of what the other option is. My vote is not an endorsement. So I think that's part of it right there.
I am astonished by the perspective that people take that the president who's running to be president no longer has to do anything to get your vote. That is profound in a representative government that people don't absorb. Look, I've been paying politics for maybe 15 years, give or take. And I think being that much more acute in the last maybe 8 or 10 per se. And it became infinitely clear, especially after 2020, that this is not a representative government in the way that people think it is. I mean, you have a candidate that's running that expects you to have no expectations of him. Only one, that he would be Joe Biden, not that he would do anything. And you have the people, 70%, nearly 80% saying, you're right. How's that isn't that astonishing? That's accepted.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think another big part of it is this, and this is a discussion that has been going on. I remember a Washington Post poll a long time ago, and it was the difference between the Bernie people and the Hillary people in 2016. And a big part of the discussion in that article, I wish I had it all, had it in front of me right now. I should have brought it up. But it was about how they, the problem they see is and I think it comes to now, what's the problem? Is the problem Donald Trump, right? Or is a result of the problem Donald Trump? So the people who see the problem as Donald Trump and say, look, the systems maybe have some problems, but it's fixable, it's manageable. We just need a different manager. So the Democrats argue, we're going to give you a different systems manager. And then there's another group of people that say, no, the system is the problem. So, just giving us a different manager is not the issue. And we're looking at the system as a very, very problematic system. So if you're not going to make any attempts to change, fix, repair the system, we don't see that as doing any good. So a big part of this argument is much deeper than Trump or Biden. It's the reason that you think it's important to vote for Biden or to vote for Trump or to not vote for either one of them, because what you see as the problem, people like me look at Biden and I say, well, one of the things that's going to happen if Biden comes in, certainly things are crashing, we're going to be in a depression, and we know the game. A year from now, the Republicans are going to say, under Joe Biden in the last year, and then they're going to list everything that happened and say it's Biden's fault. And we'll just continue this politics of, no, well, we got to get rid of Biden and get a different person. No, we got to get rid of that person and get a different person. As the system has completely and totally crashed and there's poverty and all kinds of terrible things, we'll continue arguing over which person is to manage over this, this dumpster fire.
It is a dumpster fire, and it's like every day, it's like we're watching the slow motion demolition of a building, but that building is our country, it's our state. It's sad, it's bad. I think you're right. The way I was framing this specifically yesterday is that from the left, if you're somebody who would consider voting Democrat who's wondering whether you should vote Biden, the real thing here, and it's why you're wondering, is as far as I can tell, do you want to support this guy in opposition to Trump? Whether, framing it as that conflict, Trump versus Biden, or do you want to try to reform the Democratic Party in some sense, implicitly, intuitively, if that's what you're going for? In other words, are you going to refuse to vote for the opponent, the party that you would normally vote for? Are you going to refuse to vote for that party as a boycott, basically, as a political rejection? And I think you're right. What makes the difference fundamentally is whether you see it as a system that's broken or whether you see Donald Trump as a fluke that, happened miraculously in a wave somehow centered on 2015, 2016 that included Brexit, all this stuff. If you see that as inexplicable, then you're right. I think you're going to vote Biden. But if you see that as systemic, then you're probably going to choose something a bit different. It's the demolition, the destruction. It's frustrating. You have a front line seat to this stuff. Where do you think that's going to go? I don't mean to repeat myself because this is a sort of variation of the last question asked the next couple of months. Where do you think that's going to go? But specifically for the left, what are their alternatives, and where do you think they can go? Where do you think in the next couple of months, in the next year, where do you think some alternatives might spring up? What are you looking for there? What's your take in our last couple of minutes, Garland?
Yeah, let's see. A lot of it depends on the election. Certainly, I think that as right now, the U.S. is a shambles, an absolute shambles, and to some extent, it's a failed state. And it's interesting to watch our foreign policy team pretend like everything is normal, when we're a failed state. But I do see if the government does not address the economic problems, things can spin out of control. Things can definitely spin out of control here in the United States within the next months going into the election, and there's no way to tell how bad it could get. I do think that there'll be kind of a little whiplash on Capitol Hill out of desperation, that they will maybe see things going really, really bad, and Congress will come together and say, uh-oh, we got to do something, and try to, hopefully, the way Congress has been doing it will probably be too little too late. So I think, there's no way of telling what's going to happen right now. If I had to bet, I'd bet Trump wins. And then we're going to have a mess. Either way, we're going to have a mess. Neither party is going to accept a loss. Either party is going to say, either the Russians or the Chinese or whatever, there was some kind of fraud. So, yeah, put your seatbelts on over the next couple months.
That's the thing. Yeah. And that's key economic indicators coming out like VIX. The markers are pointing to this being a contested election. That's what a lot of people are preparing for, whether it's the Electoral College and states getting to choose where they distribute their votes, whether it's the mail-in voting stuff, voter fraud allegations, whatever side. It's going to, I think you're right. I think it's going to be that way. Darling, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it ends up in the Supreme Court.
That's terrifying. Honestly, that's terrifying. Donald Trump calls it on election night saying, I win, because the votes are still coming in from mail. And then you get Democrats winning, a month later? What does that look like?
Yeah. And with like just back and forth violence in the streets. Again, not even the rioting, but literally just the left-right thing going on where people are constantly attacking each other. It's not, I don't know, it's not good going into it. Again, Garland, thank you for joining us. We're out of time. We're going to have to go into our break, going into our last hour. That was the voice of Garland Nixon. He is a Sputnik political analyst and the co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. That airs Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern right here on Radio Sputnik. We'll be back in a minute with our last hour. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back, coming to you live from across the divided states of America, bringing you the most disruptive and educative educational show in American politics on the West Coast and in the independent corner. I am investigative political analyst and radio talk show co-host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host, of course, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamal Thomas.
Together, laying down bricks on that wall, or maybe tearing down the wall. Really, Jamarl, we need to figure out what that wall represents. Anyway, on that wall for now, we are fault lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Can't tear down that wall, Shane. That wall is a wall of ideology and ideas that we hold sacred. That I think at the very lowest common denominator, we hold sacred. That's what that wall is.
The question, though, is that whether that wall of ideology holds terrors at bay or whether it just keeps us apart. And maybe it does both. Maybe it does neither. I don't know. We've got headlines to do. I think we should get into them. First up, in the news. Oh, man. Wait, hang on just 1 second. There we go. First up, presidential candidate Joe Biden is traveling to Kenosha, Wisconsin today. While there, he's expected to meet with the family of Jacob Blake. That's the 29-year-old man who was shot in the back, triggering protests and some rioting in that city over the last couple of weeks. Biden's visit there comes 2 days after Trump's visit. While Trump was there, he did not meet with the family of Jacob Blake. That will be the key parallel people draw, I think, as the two presidential candidates going into 2020 obviously have visited the city in recent days. In our next headline, President Trump is going after funding to mayors of states he says are being soft on crime. In a tweet yesterday, he said his administration, quote, will do everything in its power to prevent weak mayors and lawless cities from taking federal dollars while they let anarchists harm people, burn buildings, and ruin lives and businesses. We're putting them on notice today. End quote. Right after that, in that same tweet, he tagged the director of the Office of Management and Budget, I guess just to slam home exactly what he was implying there. This, by the way, follows a weeks-long back and forth conflict between President Trump and Mayor Ted Wheeler of Portland, also just mayors of many cities, including Lori Lightfoot in Seattle, just mayors of a bunch of different cities. But earlier in the night, a couple of hours earlier specifically, he'd actually the president had mocked Ted Wheeler for having to leave his house, apparently, because protesters were protesting there. Anyway, in our next headline, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is advising states that a vaccine will likely be ready November 1st. That came in a letter to governors. That letter also said that the first recipients of that vaccine will be hospitals and health departments. That makes sense, In our next headline, Tom Seaver has died. The American baseball pitcher, also known as Tom Terrific and the Franchise, once played for the New York Mets, the Cincinnati Reds, the Chicago White Sox, and the Boston Red Sox over an almost 20-year career stretching from 1967 to 1986. That came before he was inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame by the highest percentage of votes ever recorded. Seaver had suffered from memory problems for years, starting in, I believe it was 2013, until he was diagnosed with dementia in 2019. After that, he formally withdrew from public life. When he passed away in his sleep, it was from the combined consequences of dementia and COVID-19. In our next headline, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the deficit will reach $3.3 trillion in the fiscal year starting October 1st. That's the one, a little bit less than a month from now. That will be more than triple last year's deficit and the largest gap since World War II. And that would put the U.S. in the same class of countries that includes Japan, Greece, and Italy, where the budget deficit is about the same as the GDP. So we're quickly reaching that point. Having said that, most of this, the vast majority of this, was in our coronavirus response. So the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, I'm sure, added quite a bit to that. You can see it right there in the math. Anyway, we'll see how that continues. In our next headline, the University of South Carolina is reporting that more than 1,200 coronavirus infections, with more than 100 new cases each day since the school reopened 2 weeks ago. That infection rate was reportedly 28% at the school as of last week. This is a university reported as having the highest infection rate in the U.S. Again, seeing a lot of new cases just in a couple of weeks. The university has cracked down on off-campus parties, but they've said they have no plans to cancel in-person classes. France, meanwhile, is announcing a multi-billion-dollar recovery plan for COVID, including a plan to hire around 160,000 people to, among other things, build green tech transportation, build more housing, and promote social cohesion. In our next headline, a typhoon is hitting South Korea today, taking down power to nearly 300,000 homes there. This comes after it scrambled seas to the southeast. In Japan specifically, Japan's Coast Guard is searching for a livestock ship that was supposed to have capsized in that storm. That ship was carrying 43 members of crew, as well as at least 6,000 head of cattle from New Zealand to China. Only one member of that crew has been rescued so far. And from what I've heard, it was a little bit, the reports were kind of confusing. They seemed still uncertain about the exact fate of that ship. Our next headline, Nancy Pelosi has claimed that she was set up by a San Francisco salon where on Monday she went and got a blowout, like a hairstyle, hair makeover thing, redo. I've never had my hair done and I'm bald at this point, so please forgive me for being out of touch. Anyway, she claims that she was set up after they invited her in. This place was closed down. San Francisco has the whole lockdown thing. They hit it hard and early with the lockdowns, and they take this stuff seriously. Now, again, she's claiming that she was set up by that salon and demanding an apology from them. I don't know that that's a good look, Nancy. I'm not just talking about the hairdo. In our next headline, the United States has imposed sanctions on International Criminal Court officials over their probe into the United States war crimes in Afghanistan. Specifically, they're going after ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. They're also going after the ICC's head of jurisdiction, complementary, and cooperation division, Bakiso Mochochoko. Yeah, that's not good. They got some pushback from the Dutch government, which is the home of the ICC. And yeah, the United States increasingly at odds with the international bodies it once presided over, as far as I can tell. It was once the sort of chief, maybe benefactor. I don't know how you'd want to view this stuff, but definitely, earlier on in the 20th century, the United States was pretty pivotal to that stuff. Now we're sharply turning away from them, rebuking them and being rebuked by them. It's market. Anyway, in my last headline this morning, protests erupted in Rochester, New York after police there released body cam footage on Wednesday showing Rochester officers handcuffing Daniel Prude. It was earlier this year, placing a hood over his head and pressing his face into the pavement until he is silent. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're taking calls. 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Yeah. Oh, man. It's good. I'm going to be honest, Jamarl. We're a couple of months into doing this stuff. I like being a radio show host. This is fun. We get to talk about stuff every morning. That's my job, basically, is we just talk about stuff on the air, with cool people all the time. I don't mean to be too introspective or awkward or weird here saying this on the air, but it's fun, man.
I enjoy what I do. I do the news, right? How can I not enjoy it? I get to get my biases, my anger, and I get to engage, right, with other people who can push back on that, where you kind of come to some level of a resolution. No, I like it. It's an expansive job. The thing that's running through my head that I can't, for whatever reason, get out, even though there's something else I want to talk about, is this notion of Joe Biden as a savior. For some reason, that bothers me to such a great degree, because it's an acceptance of, look, I think what happens is you have a group of people who are Democrats who want basically this kind of soothing mirage of normality, with that normality being this kind of managed chaos. We accept a certain degree of desperation of people who are in dire straits and people who can't make ends meet and people who are in just violence and crime. We accept all of that. We accept even a certain degree of riots. We accept the destruction of, from the standpoint of trade deals and everything else, the industrialization of these areas. We accept that stuff. However, we want it managed. We don't like Trump, and so we need to get Trump out of office. Now, the problem with this is, if you accept all of that stuff, you also have to accept what comes from that. Meaning, when people start burning things down, that's part of it. It has to be. They're intrinsically linked. One is not without the other. Why do you think they're doing that in France? Why do you think they're saying, all right, we're going to have a Green New Deal and we're going to have social cohesion? What does that mean? I love that sanitized word. That means we're going to do things to stop people from burning stuff down. We need to bring these people back into the community. We cannot have alienated communities that are positioned and antagonistic to the government and to the rest of the population doing things that are against our collective interests. That they may, for whatever particular reason, found in the way that they go about their way, that this is right or this is wrong based on their experiences. I'm saying we don't get that. And because we don't get that, for whatever reason, we want to go back to the other guy who basically helped engineer all of the stuff that we are complaining about now. It bugs me. But one other thing that leads to that, Shane, Trump calling anarchists. One of my biggest concerns was when the United States started using this term terrorist, was that it didn't have a meaning. It just was relative. It's not us. And relative to not being us, it's just them. Now, those guys could call themselves freedom fighters under the same idea. We're freedom fighters. Yes, we're doing grimy, grisly things in pursuit of a goal, but they're doing grimy, grisly things in pursuit of their goal also. So we are paragons of virtue in comparison. You can do that back and forth. It doesn't mean anything. I thought that language at some point would be turned onto the United States, where they would call people who are doing things terrorists. Whether you call them terrorists or whether you call them anarchists, you end up almost at the same place. I want to point something else out. At no point does Donald Trump ever criticize his own side, while he would scream for Joe Biden to criticize people who he claimed are on Joe Biden's side. They're not, by the way. If you notice, when that young terrorist, the terror shooter, right-wing kid, Kip Rittenhouse, went over there, murdered two people, what did Trump say? Well, I mean, I think he was defending himself from a plastic bag. Now, this is not a criticism by any degree. He wouldn't do it. Even those people in Charlottesville, they're good people on both sides. He immediately gets Joe Biden to go and criticize protesters and rioters. And Joe Biden not having sense enough to be able to give a clean, articulate response into precursors and so forth, and doing so. These things are bothering me greatly. The anarchist thing is a dodge for people who are pissed off about the way their society is. Do you see that? Or do you think that there are actual people who are called anarchists who are angry and whatnot in doing so? Meaning, I guess what I'm getting at is, do you see how that can be politics as opposed to actual reality of the reason people are doing things?
I'm going to be honest. I'll put my bias up front. It is difficult for me to care about the anarchist thing specifically just because I don't see it as a pejorative. Like, sure, some anarchists are bad, but there are a bunch of different kinds of anarchists all over the political spectrum who want different things from society, and it's just a shade of political opinion.
No. I get that. Don't misunderstand me. I know that is a flat fact definition.
I led with my bias.
No, I get that, but most people don't understand that. Like, most people don't get that anarchists are that way. They're using it as a smear, in a sense.
Totally. No, like I said, I'm just putting my bias up front. That is my personal perspective. Having said that, I can see how you looking at it, it's a term like terrorist, for instance. It's arguably a bit more flexible than terrorism because usually terrorists are people who have killed people or are planning on killing people. Whereas if you're an anarchist, I don't know exactly what you're planning on doing. Anything from throwing a bottle through a window to growing a garden in your backyard or organizing some local event. I don't know. It's just my point is, again, a bit of personal bias there, but another side of this is I understand what you're saying. This could just become a symbol that's sort of used as a cudgel to shut down thought, to shut down speech, to justify violence. I can see that. I think what might keep that from having legs is that unlike terrorist, it is not inherently a violent pejorative term. It's not inherently something that induces mortal dread. I think for some people, if you're a Republican and you're watching this stuff and you already didn't like anarchists or whatever, and it's a term that you have pretty strong disdain for, yeah, that's going to be a rallying cry. But for a wider social thing, I don't think that it can capture the public's attention in the same way that the term terrorist did as an idea. We're going to go into a break, Jamarl. I don't mean to cut off there. We're going to have time. I'll let you bring us back in. Until then, we're taking calls 202-521-1320, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live out of our station in DC. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share this video or share that audio clip. If you want to join the conversation, you can always send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So we were talking about anarchists and this notion of it being used as a smear. My fear of it, or my concern, is that whether you're talking about a terrorist or whether you're talking about an anarchist, it's just the intention of the term. Meaning you can use anything as a smear. You can use or say, you can have, in fact, create an inflection just in the way that you're dealing with somebody, where the most basic things can become a smear. In this very specific case, Americans don't know the specific definition of an anarchist. So it's flexible in regards to how it can be used. But that flexibility can also trend into the notion of being a catch-all. Meaning something happens, a large number of people respond to that something happening. So let's say a cop kills somebody. That cop murdering somebody, let's say it's come out, or even the medical examiner says, yes, this is a murder. Those people rise up, angry, indignant. You find out that particular area had, let's say, 40% poverty in the African-American community. Let's say 30% Hispanic community. Let's say you find out that unemployment rate was high. Let's say you find out a series of other indicators that give to you this notion that, oh my God, these people were living through hell for 10 years and it's only gotten worse. But Trump says those anarchists are out in the streets protesting. Those anarchists are once again burning stuff down. Look at those anarchists. And then points to Joe Biden and say, you, Joe Biden, are weak on those anarchists doing those things. Now, the reality of it is, it's not anarchists at all. It's people who are angry that something, once again, has happened. And there was zero tolerance, and not just zero tolerance, a tinderbox waiting to explode based on everything that was taking place in their community, that even though they could not entirely associate with their government because they internalized it just like a lot of other people, white, black, gay, straight, across the board, across the United States, they internalized it as their own fault. When that happened, it became kinetic. And regardless of having the language to get it across, the language they end up using is, I am going to set that thing on fire. I'm going to burn that thing to the ground. Now, it's not that you have to like it. I don't. I also don't like the precursors to it. And if Trump is going to wrap Joe Biden in that, especially from the standpoint of this person got shot, this person got killed, whatever else, then he is also to some degree tacitly connected to the protests or to the rioting. That's the logic of it. Now, Joe Biden has associated himself with this stuff, so Trump can say, yeah, I'm here for law and order. That guy is for the protests. So Joe Biden has to come out and now attack protesters. African Americans, whites, poor, etc., that he wants their vote. And Joe Biden is going to do it. And he's not going to do it in a logical fashion. He's going to do it in this very snippet way that, just like that other speech, didn't necessarily get to the nub of the issue, which allows Trump to basically score points on this issue. It's the weirdest aspect of politics.
Here's the other thing: is that unlike terrorists, there's one other big difference here. It's not about anarchists in the U.S. right now. Really, frankly, that when Trump is talking about anarchists, I think, frankly, he views them largely as puppets.
Yes.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, please call in to correct me. But I think he views them largely as puppets, as sort of volatile, violent, dangerous, but limited, kind of relatively weak puppets of the Democratic Party that they're using to agitate in 2020 to get reelected, that they're using to try to take him down, basically. I think that's the terms that he's painting things in, and I certainly think that's how his base sees it, although I think I don't want to misrepresent here. So please, if I'm wrong, call in and tell me. 202-521-1320. Call in, and I'm absolutely open to it. Again, 202-521-1320. We are taking calls right now.
It's like the Kennedy missile gap.
I think that's the difference, though. I think that's the difference crucially, is that unlike with terrorists, where they were a sort of external enemy who were universally seen as bad and were sort of inherent to themselves an enemy, it's just about politics back in the States right now, as far as I can tell.
No,
people are concerned about civil unrest and a civil war and stuff, but I think largely, for the most part, people see this on the right as a Democrat thing, not as like an incipient, huge civil war thing that's about to break out. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's both.
I think it's darker than that. Because look, if Trump is doing that, think of it this way: Trump is about 30% of the voting population. Whether that's enough to win or not is regardless. They have about 30%. Those people believe a lot, pretty much everything Trump says in many respects. Trump comes out and says they're anarchists, and he's using this term to say people who are starting fires, rioting, causing violence, beating people up, and that's the language that they're using for him. So every time he says anarchist, that's the way he's defined this. And that's the way that his own people, a group, even Republicans for the some part, agrees. And he ties it to Democrats. That's the point. Like all of those things that he declared that he doesn't like, that the public thinks are the aspects of those protests, the worst aspects of those things. He is painting a broad brushstroke that is basically making the point that anybody that is out there protesting and rioting are basically anarchists. Now that's utterly ludicrous, but that's the argument to which he's framing this as. And Joe Biden is going to go out and give a speech to some degree legitimizing that. Trump never goes after his own, despite the fact that these guys are nationalists and paramilitaries and is going into these fights, believing we're fighting anarchists. No, you're fighting protesters. I'm making the point that there's a conflation that's taking place, and it's a dangerous conflation.
All right, Jamarl, we should go to calls.
You're right. Let's go to calls.
But we have
callers. You're right.
3 callers on the line, and we're running out of time. We've got Michael calling in from Silver Spring. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hi, I love the show, and it gives me a reason to wake up on time. Thanks. I just want to say that I don't think they're even counting the votes. You put your vote in the ballot, and then they just throw the votes away. However, they do it at the end of the night. And I spoke to someone who works with the polls, and that's what she told me. And my question is, do you guys know anyone who works in the polling stations, and have they said the same thing? Because if it's done if I know somebody, then it's obviously done widespread. So I don't think it should be a problem finding someone to verify that they're not even counting the vote. So it's not representative. It's government. Thanks.
My grandmother used to work at a polling location in Virginia. I mean, I don't know if that's representative of anything. Look, our society, on some degree, you have a certain degree of trust. There's no way around it. Any bit of information that you get mostly comes to you from somebody else, from somewhere else, et cetera, including in elections. Is it possible that they're doing it? Yes. Is it likely? I'm doubtful. I don't even think you need to do that.
It's hard to detect.
Right, exactly. But you don't need to do that in large measure. Like, you could do that around the edges, especially in places like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania where the vote total is close. Like, you don't need that heavy hand.
Yeah. I mean, but here's the thing. So if you're doing it, I mean, historically, obviously, you would do it with paper. And then the problem there is that people could be tampering with it on site. That's one of the big concerns. And then, of course, if you replace that with a machine, then the concern is that people are altering the code of the machines to tamper with it not on site to tamper, with it on the code level. So the point is, it's just by definition those things are hard to detect. It's like a cat and mouse game of encryption, decryption, where you're trying to figure out how people can mess up your system. It's one of those problems. That's my sort of limited baseline understanding of it. I've looked into a couple of these things, but I'm by no means an expert. I think we should go to other calls. We've got Michael. Pardon me. Thank you for the call, Michael. We got Bruce calling in from Wisconsin. Bruce, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hi, guys. You were just talking about this idea of wall, and said it was a wall of ideology. And I think you're on to something. And that we're being kept apart. The old strategy of divide and conquer, which is older than humans themselves. And we're divided by ideologies and labels. And one of the ones that bothers me the most is the whole idea that there's a spectrum of left and right. And a guy named Alfred North Whitehead, about 100 years ago, philosopher, I think he'd call that misplaced concreteness, which means people like to think in terms of concepts. And the idea of right and left, it comes from the French Revolution, from where people sat in this courtyard. The people who wanted to kill the king, they sat on the left, and people that didn't want to, wanted more of a monarchy like England, they sat on the right, But to use that concept of right and left to divide us, and people put themselves willingly on this line, and they think it's real, and the news media treats it like it's real, but it's not. It's a concept. It really doesn't exist. It's just something, it's a way of thinking that we're expected just to conform to. I no longer consider myself anywhere on that spectrum.
Thank you,
Wait,
Bruce.
I'm sorry. What did you say right at the end there? You said something about on that spectrum. What did you say?
He no longer considers himself on the spectrum.
Yeah, I don't conform to that anymore. I think about, I know a lot of people, and we have far more in common than we have differences, but they keep dividing us, and that's one of the big problems that we've got in this country.
Bruce, thank you.
Bruce, thank you for the call. I agree with the content and the tenor of your call. Thank you for everything.
Agree,
I just want two things here real quick. You're talking about A.N. Whitehead. I only know him as a mathematician, briefly as a philosopher, but the co-author, I think, with Bertrand Russell, the Principia Mathematica. That's a pretty influential book on axioms and stuff. Anyway, turns out I wasn't familiar with misplaced concreteness. It's another way of reification, this fallacy of reification, basically, where you have an idea and you view it as an object, where you sort of, take something that's subjective and treat it as objective. That's exactly what you're talking about, and I think you're right. I'm going to introduce another concept briefly here, which is this idea of a skeuomorph, which is if you have a technology, for instance, you will inherit, even though you don't need it, you'll inherit some of the older features of older technologies into new technologies. So, for instance, web pages will often look like physical things. They'll look, especially in the earlier days, they were constructed to look like physical things that we were used to looking at. Even though, with the color space of a computer, you could make it look like anything. My point is, in a weird way, by bringing the left-right dichotomy, where literally it was just the wings of a hall, it's like we've inherited this self-definition, this way of seeing ourselves ideologically. You're right. It has nothing to do with reality. It was just convenient at one point, and it's a cast that we've applied to ourselves over time, and it's sad. And I think you're right that it's time for us to rethink that, or at least that's what I would say. I don't know if you said that, but Bruce from Wisconsin, thank you so much for the call. We've got one more caller, Rod. I want to get to you on the other side of this break. We'll have a minute, I believe. Until then, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm going to go to Rod. Rod calling in from Philly. Rod, you're on the line. What's going on?
What's going on, guys? I just, caught the first hour of this since 9 o'clock, and I was listening in. And I just want to talk about what we were talking about, anarchy and definition and stuff like that. And there was Mr. Rittenhouse was defined as a terrorist, which I don't think he's even close to a terrorist. It's just a young kid who made a stupid decision to show up with a gun. But if you watch the video, he clearly wasn't the aggressor. He was just defending himself. And even the last guy he shot in the arm had a gun pointing to his head. So either he was going to let himself get killed or he was going to shoot and defend himself. So what he did was he defended himself. I don't think he's a terrorist. And the Charlottesville incident, I just want to talk about the Charlottesville incident because it was just a coincidence. My first time ever in Charlottesville was literally 3 weeks before that incident itself. I was in Charlottesville, and it was right before school started. And then, by the park, all the way at the law school, that's how far we had to park to even get fine parking, to even walk into that area where that incident happened. It's the strangest thing that Vice was there. It had all these cameras and all these stuff. And nobody was ever identified from Charlottesville. You have clear video and photographic evidence. People were walking with tiki torches, saying Jews won't replace us. But none of those people were ever identified. But if you compare that to the Covington incident with that kid, Sandman, was just standing in front of the Native American man, I mean, immediately he was identified and he was harassed, and the whole mainstream media was attacking him. So you see how that dichotomy is. You have a whole incident where you have people saying Jews will not replace us, but nobody was identified, versus a young child who, from a Catholic school, was just at a March for Life, was identified and harassed.
Thanks for the call. Thank you for the call. Look, cameras are a different place at different times, I suppose. And you could say that kid, this gets into the whole thing of what a thing is and how you define a thing. Is it a freedom fighter or is it something else? Is that person ill and reckless, or is that person bold and brave and courageous? I mean, it's a point of view quirk. Yeah, he was a kid that made a stupid mistake. He was also a kid that was ensconced in a certain degree of ideology, loving cops, right-winger, goes to a place with a gun and fulfills his ideology. I don't know how that's different than what we would consider to be a terrorist in some other country doing the exact same thing. So fair enough, but thank you for the call. Let's get to our guests, actually, because I don't want to keep the guests when we bring the guests on. So we are joined. Well, we're joined by.
We've got one caller, but we're joined by Dr. Linwood Tauheed, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Jamarl, I can tell there's a little bit of confusion in the chat there, but I can go with it. Anyway, Dr. Tauheed, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. Better for having you. Thank you again for being with us. So the jobs numbers came out a little while ago. I believe the number was 881,000 new jobless claims, which is down from the more than 1 million we've seen pretty much continuously for weeks now. So it's down a bit, but it's still not a good situation. It's down relative to the bad that was, and it still is bad. It's just it's slowly gotten less worse as time has gone on. What's your take on the real state of the economy and these new jobs numbers? Where are these going to take us just in themselves? Not even looking at politics, not anything like that, just the economy itself.
Well, we should be cautious about this new number because there's a new way of calculating this number that puts an asterisk on that calculation. The new way of calculating the number actually lowers the estimate it makes the estimate a little lower than it would have been if it was calculated in the old way. So if we're going to compare apples to apples, the new figures calculated in the old way would probably represent not very much of a change, about 1 million new unemployment claims per week, which means that we're kind of bumping along the bottom of a long stasis. We are kind of maintaining the same level of unemployment and economic activity that we've been in for at least a month.
Doctor.
And so, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Finish. I'm sorry. There was a break. I thought you were finished talking. Please finish.
Yeah. So we're not recovering. We're not falling. Like the economy is not falling over the cliff as quickly as it had since March when the coronavirus crisis hit. But we're not recovering.
Let me ask you this: are you, I guess, surprised by these numbers? I mean, even if these numbers, let's say, were 1 million, let's say they were, the new process or the new system wasn't part of it, shouldn't these numbers be higher? I mean, when we look at it, the loans that were going out, or the unemployment insurance, has stopped, meaning the extra $600 that honestly was not just keeping our economy afloat, giving it a slight extra bump, because these people who were on a minimum wage basically got like $100 extra or $200 extra dollars. That's evaporated. With the floor, shouldn't that number then be higher, especially as you're looking at like retail markets and you're looking at down service people who no longer are getting that money that these people can't spend anymore?
Right. Well, there's always going to be a lag in the reporting. And so what's going on out in the real world with people who no longer have the $600 a week is that we're going to see that effect on the economy in the coming weeks. And so we're kind of in a lull here. People have who have been laid off, let's say from quote from work, did attempt to go back to work. Businesses attempted to open again because of $600 a week. There was money flowing through the economy. And so businesses would call workers they had laid off back to work, or they were receiving money through the payroll protection to pay employees who to not lay them off. Once that stops, then we will have an effect. But the effect is not going to be as immediate as 1 week to the next. But I expect that if there's no replacement for the $600 a week and no replacement for payroll protection, that we will very quickly see those unemployment numbers go up again as people are laid off. So we're kind of in the eye of the storm, if you will, where things are well, not good, but they've leveled off. But the storm is coming again. We're going to see another surge in unemployment unless Congress can, one, do something and get money pushed out into the economy very, very quickly, and they haven't been able to do that in the past. There are persons who still have not gotten their $1,200 one-time payment, and there are persons who still haven't gotten all of the $600 a week payments that they were entitled to. And the new Trump administration offer of the $300 a week instead of the $600 a week, very, very few people have gotten those payments.
Dr. Tauheed, I want to switch topics very slightly. We're talking about unemployment numbers, unemployment benefits, people not receiving those, this whole cluster of problems. And those are, I think you're going to be right. We're in the eye of the storm right now. We're going to start to see the effects of those very soon. I'm actually curious, though, about a headline that is about something a little bit deeper and wider. I wanted to get your take on it. It's more like a Leviathan sort of lurking under the surface, which is the deficit. The Congressional Budget Office yesterday estimated that the deficit will be reaching $3.3 trillion. That's, as we reported in headlines, more than triple last year's and the largest gap since World War II. The other big side of this headline is that it would be the first time since World War II, reportedly, that the deficit has matched the GDP, that the deficit has grown to be 100%, has grown to, in some potentially outstrip the size of the gross domestic product on an annual basis. And then the last part of this would be putting us in a class of countries alongside Japan, Greece, and Italy, who have also been riddled, the world sort of perspective on this, riddled in the long term by, long-term monetary problems and various debt crises. Where do you think that leaves us? Should we make too much? What do you think we should make of that? Us being in that class, is that real? Or is there some key difference that might help, like a rope hanging down into a pit that we're stuck in, that might help to extricate us from that situation? Or are we just, screwed, to put it bluntly?
Yeah, well, let me just say this overall. We should ignore the deficit hysteria. But here are a couple of reasons. You mentioned a couple of countries. You mentioned Greece and Japan. The situation for Greece and the situation for Japan are very different, in that Greece is a country as part of the European Union, and it does its economic business in euros, and so the country of Greece is not in control of its own currency. Greece can only go into deficit if the European Union, the European Central Bank, allows it to go into deficit. Japan, on the other hand, has complete control of its own currency. And even though it's been in, officially a recessionary state for about 2 decades, the Japanese people are not suffering because the Japanese treasury is able to continue to push money out into the economy. And so that economy is going along actually pretty well in terms of the lives of people. Now, on paper, yes, the deficit in Japan is up, but the deficit really doesn't matter in this case when Japan has the ability to create its own money. Greece is different. Greece is not in deficit, at least not to the extent that Japan is, and it can't spend money, let's say, to decrease its unemployment, because it can't borrow those euros from the European Central Bank. So Greece and Japan are 2 different kinds of countries. Now, Japan is more like the United States, and let's think about it this way: this country has gone into a $3.3 trillion deficit over the last 3 or 4 months since coronavirus hit. What would have happened if that money was not created and pushed out into the economy? We'd be looking at worse than Great Depression levels of unemployment. We were at 20% during the depths of the Great Depression of the 30s. Unemployment hit 25%, official unemployment. We would have surpassed that. We would have done worse than that. And so pushing that $3.3 trillion out into the country actually prevented the economy from collapsing completely. And so if that wasn't done, then we would be in dire straits. We wouldn't be talking about, woe is me over the deficit. We will be talking about unemployment rate and levels of economic despair and anxiety that we've never seen before. And so I'm from a point of view that says that deficits during down times should actually increase. $3.3 trillion is really not enough, because it didn't get us back to recovery at the level that the economy was going on before. We were at 3% unemployment when the coronavirus hit. We're at 9%. We need to spend more money to get us back to 3%.
I'm so glad you said that. And I want to get back into the economics of this, because you're right. You're absolutely right. Should there have been expenditures, let's say the COVID-19, let's say this virus never hit, should those expenditures have taken place anyway in order to, well, there's a school of thought that says deficits don't matter, or at the very least deficits don't matter up into the context of real things that you have in your economy to spend. Let's say an MMT perspective. I want to have a conversation with you about that, especially in the context of now and everything that is going on when we come back. So you guys are listening to Dr. Linwood Tauheed, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Oregon. We'll be back in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Dr. Linwood Taid, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I want to get into this notion of how we spend our cash and when we spend our cash and what we choose to spend that money on. The United States, we're at $27 trillion, $27 trillion in debt. And this is not a situation where the country has, let's say, environmental policy that deals with a Green New Deal. I mean, regardless of what people think of money, how real they think that money is, it is only conceptual. The environment is real. And if it tanks, you can't eat your dollars, nor would it be a flotation device. On the other hand, you get into this notion of healthcare, where you look at other countries around the world, they have healthcare, we don't. And this is, again, over 20-something trillion dollars in debt. When people make this argument that, look, the issue here is we have a fiat currency, we're a sovereign currency, and that we can spend money on things that we need and that the public requires, up into the level it gets to dealing with inflation. Meaning, as long as there are real resources for something, you can basically spend money on it because ultimately the money is not real. That what's real is, let's say, the labor in your society, whether you have the resources for X or for Y in your society, and how that stuff is managed. If they spent $3.3 trillion on COVID-19 just in an instant, shouldn't that money have also been spent on domestic priorities to ensure that the public was made whole before this virus ever hit? If I'm making sense in saying, if that makes sense. I hope I'm making sense in what I'm trying to get across.
I think to make a couple of points about modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theorists would argue that certainly in times of unemployment, we should spend whatever we need to spend to get back to full employment. But that once we get back to full employment, we should stop spending. Otherwise, we'll cause inflation. So it's not let's spend forever. It's spending for a purpose. It's spending to get the real resources, including labor, back to work. Okay. Now let's get an idea of what $3.3 trillion is. $3.3 trillion is $3.3 million. Now this is an easy calculation. There are about 330 million people in the U.S., which means that we could distribute $3.3 trillion by sending $10,000 to every person in the country. Now, obviously, that did not happen. So the question is, where was the $3.3 trillion spent? It obviously wasn't spent in the right places to get us back to a 3% unemployment rate. $10,000 to every person would have allowed people to continue to pay their rent, to pay their mortgages, to buy the food that they were buying when they were employed. It could have been used to put folks to work on environmental controls, Green New Deal, as you mentioned. It could have been spent in healthcare. It could have been spent in a lot of places, but it obviously was not spent in those places. There are persons who were promised a $1,200 one-time payment who haven't received that $1,200 yet. There's the $600 a week extended unemployment benefits for which many people have not yet received that check, those checks that they were eligible for. And so if you want to look at an accounting of how we got to a $3.3 trillion increase in the debt or deficit, then it obviously wasn't spent with what we would call Main Street. It was spent with it was sent out to businesses that took out loans that would turn into grants that probably did not need to actually have those loans, because we don't see the effect of that money in the economy. It's one thing to get money that you have to spend. That creates the demand in the economy that increases economic activity. If companies are getting money out of this $3.3 trillion that they don't need to spend, there's no effect on the economy. It just increases their bank account. So you're absolutely right. It's not just the idea that we can create money. It's important how we spend money. And spending money by sending it to people who are going to spend it is the way that you recover an economy.
Dr. Tauheed, I actually wanted to ask about one of the sort of pivotal points there. You said that under modern monetary theorist ideas, under modern monetary theory, it would be a good idea to release money into the economy, to create money in the economy, to spend, for the government to spend money, basically, up to the point at which you've lowered unemployment to a certain, minimal positive extent. I'm not going to give an exact number, but basically, a very small amount that, everybody effectively is fully employed. What is that? And then past that point, you said it is no longer effective. I'm curious, two questions here. Why is that? Why is it that point that's the pivotal point? And then two, what are the downsides? What are the negative effects? Is it just inflation, or are there other things that would follow on too, coming with inflation, if you were to pass that point?
Well, once you get to a point in which you have full employment, and you're right not to put a number on it, but in recent experience, it's been around 3%. That's where we were before the coronavirus hit. Once you get back to that 3%, you're essentially using all of the resources that you are able to use in the economy. And to put more money out into the economy means that you have more money than you have supply of goods and services. And so the only thing that can happen is that the price of those goods and services will go up. We call that inflation. So you don't want to cause inflation as a side effect of recovering the economy, because then that hurts people as well. And so you spend up to that point, and then you stop spending. The economy has recovered, and under normal circumstances, it would go on its own. Now we're in unusual circumstances in the sense that this crisis is caused by a coronavirus pandemic, and until we get that under control, we will expect to see continuous waves of these kind of things, of the economy needing to shut down in order to get control of the virus. That's happening in other countries that have reopened too soon, and they've seen waves again, and they've had to shut down again. We don't want to go through that. We need to get this coronavirus under control. And for me, that doesn't mean waiting for a vaccine. It means doing the things like wearing masks and maintaining social distancing that countries that have successfully fought this coronavirus have done. So we need to get that under control, but we also need to spend so that we can get back to employment, full employment. And if we're not able to open the economy so people can go back to work, we can at least send them money so they can pay their rent and buy food and pay for medicines and so forth.
Dr. Tauheed, assume for the moment Joe Biden gets in office. Let's say he wins. Mm-hmm. His people are now signaling austerity, saying that basically, hey, Donald Trump spent a ton of money. When we're going to look at the books, it's going to be horrible. Now, this happened to Obama, same way when Bush came in. George Bush spent like trillions of dollars that was never accounted for in the books, that the Democrat looks at and says, okay, now we have to be an honest vendor of the books, in which case now it is on their books. And they would be chastised saying, Obama, look at all the money look at all that debt under Obama. Well, that was Bush's debt. So when Biden gets in, same thing's going to happen. And these guys are saying, look, then this means a certain degree of austerity has to take place. What would you advise him on that? Meaning, if you were whispering in his ear, what would you tell him?
Well, I would advise him to look back at history and understand that this is a game that Republicans play on Democrats, and Democrats fall for it. Republicans, starting with Reagan, get into office and raise the deficit, to multiples of what it was before. And then when the Democrat wins, they say, well, look at the deficit, look at the debt. We can't spend any more money, so we need to go into austerity, which means that we never have austerity for military programs. We always have austerity for social programs. And so the Republicans who want to eliminate these social programs anyway put the Democrats in a bind by saying, we're already deep in debt. You can't spend more money, so you need to cut down on food stamps and Social Security and these other programs. And traditionally, Democrats have fallen for this. What the Biden administration, what a Biden administration needs to do is say, we're not going to follow that old line because we understand that spending money is what we need to do in order to recover the economy. Look, the federal government spending less money only means that the level of economic distress lingers on, and people are continuously in desperate situations. And if the Biden administration were to do that, the Biden administration will be a failed administration economically. We'll get another Republican who will spend, and particularly on the military, and then cry for deficits when the Democrats win at some point in the future, if that ever happens again. And so the Biden administration should ignore these austerity calls. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing in Biden's history that leads me to believe that he will ignore a call for austerity, that he will actually follow the old Democratic playbook of being overly sensitive about debts and deficits. I know that's depressing, but that's
it's depressing, but it's what I expect. I mean, and by the way, is it that Democrats fall for it, or is it Democrats are part of it? I mean, because let's be clear, if Democrats are paid by the exact same people that Republicans are paid by, meaning both of these people, both of these groups, everybody who's sitting in Congress, the overwhelming majority are part of this 0.1%. The people who pay them are part of the same class. Is it that Democrats fall for it, or Democrats are just a part of it? I mean, that may be more cynical.
Well, Democrats certainly have a different rhetoric than Republicans. I mean, the rhetoric out of Democrats is, I feel your pain. So I know you're suffering, but I'm sympathetic to it. The Republicans are generally say, let them eat cake. And so, yeah, that expressed sympathy for pain is something that possibly allows Democrats to actually do austerity better than Republicans will do austerity. Now, The thing is that austerity is not good for business, for big business either. Big business needs demand in the economy in order to run. And so if the donors, that is the wealthy who are donors to both parties, if they would actually be better off by spending more money. But this is a finance-driven process as opposed to an industry-driven process, where those banks and insurance companies that are lenders of money into the economy are attempting to eliminate the government as a competitor. If you don't have a job and you're not going to get, let's say, a basic income from the government, then you have to perhaps go into debt and with credit cards and so forth, and that's the business of finance. So there's this contradiction between what's good for the economy and what's good for Wall Street. So what's good for Main Street and what's good for Wall Street are many times not the same thing, and many times are very opposite. And if the Democrats, like the Republicans, listen to Wall Street instead of Main Street, then Main Street will suffer.
They don't seem to care. I mean, this seems to be ideologically driven at this point that they don't seem like everything you just said is true. Like, if you give money to people and those people have that money, they spend it, especially people at the bottom of the income scale. The Republicans, and for the most part, I would even argue the Democrats to some degree, looked at $600 and said, yeah, those guys being incrementally above poverty is too much. I agree with you, absolutely. Dr. Linwood Tauheed, thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Linwitter Lee is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow with another awesome show. I want to give a shout out to our engineers. Shout out to Garland Nixon for joining us. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow. Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. And as always, Monday through Friday, we will be here. Really interesting show today. It's always interesting having an economist on. And he would, in real terms, yes, it is beneficial to have the bottom get money. Why? Because they spend it. They can't hold it. They spend it. And what happens when they spend it? Well, it goes into this market. It goes into that bill. It goes into that thing and that thing and that thing. And what happens then? Well, it keeps those businesses afloat. And those businesses spend to get supplies and so forth. Oh, so you mean that the money doesn't vanish in thin air? No, it doesn't. So if you gave people a UBI, it would be something similar. Yes, it would. Huh. Isn't that interesting? Like, it is beneficial. It's one of those things where you're arguing for something that's to the best interest of our society in general. Ramona Lawson, put the call-in number on the screen, please. Ramona, I will do that. We try to announce it each part of the hour, but I would do that. We have no sound, Jamal. Marcus will. What do you mean we have no sound? You have sound. You have sound. Best rant yet. 825, that's funny. Bernie Guillotine. Neocons and neolibs push racial class solidarity. Won't be a race war balance in the Hamptons. So the risk... Oh, I see. So the risk we're taking. If it's a race war, it's taking place in the black communities. It's not taking place in, let's say, Beverly Hills. The catch is, what if that race war become a class war? Beverly Hills is not safe. In fact, no area. The fact that they were putting a guillotine in front of Jeff Bezos' house kind of gets across that's a fine line, that trespass at your own will. I mean, at that point, you're dealing with mob mentality. Jamal, love you, Dor, Kyle, Brooks, the most. I hope your health improves, buddy. Oh, it's fine. Look, over the course of a life, 60 years, 70 years, if you have to take X number of years to deal with health things, you may take more years than others. Fair enough. What you do with those years, right? Everybody's limitations. Depends on what you do with the limitations. It takes a certain degree of imagination and a certain degree of physical ability, yes. But you'd be surprised what you could do with a bit of will and intention. But yeah, I'm fine. It's a short period of time where shit sucks. But beyond that. All right. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. And I'm going to say thank you all for joining us. Thanks all. I'll see you guys a little bit